History, as we know it, is a puzzle missing most of its pieces. We are taught to view the past as a well-documented timeline, one event leading clearly to the next, each civilization rising and falling in orderly succession. But if you look closer, you'll see something strange. Gaps, inconsistencies, questions left unanswered for centuries, civilizations that appeared fully formed, then vanished without a trace, technologies that shouldn't have existed, cultures with no known origins, maps that show what shouldn't be there, ruins that tell a story no textbook repeats. This isn't about wild conspiracy, it's about the overlooked, the ignored, and the quietly removed. There are chapters of our human story that have been deliberately buried by empires, by religious authorities, by colonial powers, and sometimes simply by the silence of time. Some were censored to control the narrative, others were erased to protect those in power, and many more faded away because no one was left to remember them. But traces remain. Stone foundations where no cities should have been, forgotten languages carved into rock, ancient manuscripts that hint at stories we've never heard, rituals that survived in disguise. These are the breadcrumbs of a deeper, more complex past, one that refuses to stay hidden. In this investigation, we'll examine 40 of the most intriguing historical cover-ups ever recorded, or, in some cases, never officially recorded at all. Each story is based on real-world anomalies, archaeological finds, ancient texts, cultural erasures, suppressed discoveries, and unexplained artifacts. Whether the result of political motive, religious censorship, or strategic manipulation, each of these examples forces us to ask, what else have we been taught to forget? Some of these mysteries span continents. Others take place within a single document or a single missing year. But they all share one thing in common. The version of history we're told doesn't quite line up with the evidence we've found. This is not just about uncovering lost facts. It's about challenging the idea that history is settled, that the past is fixed, and that those in charge of recording it have always done so with honesty and neutrality. They haven't. The deeper you look, the more you realize that history is not just a record of what happened, it's also a record of what someone wanted remembered and what they needed forgotten. So let's begin with what may be one of the most widespread and deliberate erasures of all, a vanished superpower that appears on dozens of ancient maps and then disappears. For centuries, maps of Asia told a different story than the one we know today. On European atlases dating back to the 16th and 17th centuries, there appears a vast and seemingly powerful civilization stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, and even parts of what we now call Russia and China. This region was labeled simply Tartaria. Its borders were ambiguous, but its presence was unmistakable. Tartaria was marked as a sprawling empire, sometimes larger than the Roman Empire, with no clear capital, no named rulers, and no wars recorded in the historical canon. It appeared prominently in the works of cartographers such as Ortelius, Mercator, and Sanson. Yet by the 19th century, the word Tartaria had all but vanished from maps, from history books, and from public consciousness. What was Tartaria? Was it merely a Western label for poorly understood regions inhabited by Turkic and Mongolic peoples? Or was it something far more substantial, a forgotten empire whose very existence was slowly erased? According to the mainstream historical view, Tartary or Tartaria was not a unified empire, but a vague umbrella term used by European mapmakers to describe unknown lands to the east, a placeholder for parts of Asia that had not yet been explored or documented in detail. These lands were associated with the so-called Tartars, a collective name for a wide range of nomadic tribes including Mongols, Turks, and various steppe peoples. But that explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why would maps, official state-sanctioned maps, show Tartaria as a coherent empire for hundreds of years if it had no real political or cultural unity? Why would certain cities such as Tobolsk be labeled as capitals of Tartary? Why would some maps show architectural symbols indicating a sophisticated level of development? Castles, churches, infrastructure, across vast areas we now consider sparsely populated? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why was the name scrubbed so thoroughly and so quickly from the historical record? This has led to the rise of one of the most persistent alternative history theories in recent years. The idea that Tartaria was not merely a label, but an actual civilization, possibly highly advanced, that was intentionally wiped from the record in the 18th and 19th centuries. According to this theory, Tartaria was a powerful, technologically advanced culture, possibly with its own architectural style, energy systems, and social organization that posed a threat to the growing dominance of Western colonial powers. Its existence challenged the narrative of Western superiority, and so it was systematically erased. Proponents point to a number of intriguing clues. The sudden reclassification of Tartary in encyclopedias. For example, the 1771 Encyclopedia Britannica describes Tartary as a vast region with its own peoples, religions, and rulers. Yet by the mid-1800s, later editions treat it as a historical fiction or obsolete term. The architectural anomalies found in cities across Russia, Central Asia, and even parts of the United States, grand buildings with Greco-Roman features, massive domes, and intricate facades that seem out of place for the time and region in which they were supposedly built. These have been referred to by researchers as Tartarian architecture, reports from 19th century world fairs that showcased enormous, elaborate structures which were supposedly temporary, yet seem far too advanced and massive to have been constructed in mere months, then destroyed. Some suggest these were surviving Tartarian buildings, repurposed and then demolished. Of course, mainstream scholars reject these claims. They argue that Tartarian architecture is simply neoclassical design, popular during the 18th and 19th centuries, that the reuse of ancient styles was common, that Tartaria was a label of ignorance, not evidence of a lost empire. Still, the speed and completeness of the disappearance remain troubling. Entire libraries of documents relating to Central Asia were lost or destroyed in wars, revolutions, and border realignments during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Russian and Chinese imperial expansion swept across the region, absorbing whatever fragments of culture and memory remained. Colonial interests redefined what counted as civilization, erasing entire ways of life that didn't fit their models. And so, Tartaria became a ghost. A name no longer spoken, a blank spot filled in by new powers, new narratives, and new maps. Whether Tartaria was a real civilization or merely a concept misunderstood by early cartographers, its erasure is undeniable. Something was removed, whether fact or fiction, and in its absence, a question remains. What else has been rewritten? What other civilizations may have existed just beyond the reach of official history, waiting to be rediscovered? The fall of the Minoans, the empire swallowed by the sea. Long before the rise of Athens, before the glories of Sparta, before even the myths of Troy were first whispered around firelight, there was Crete. And on that island, surrounded by the Aegean Sea, a civilization emerged so sophisticated, so ahead of its time, that it would take centuries for history to catch up. We call them the Minoans, named after the legendary King Minos, a figure of myth more than record. The Minoans were among the first truly complex societies in Europe. They built sprawling palaces with dozens, even hundreds of rooms. They created intricate art, practiced advanced trade, and developed systems of writing. Their cities had sanitation systems that wouldn't be rivaled for thousands of years. Their ships crossed vast waters, connecting cultures across the Mediterranean. But most curious of all, they left almost no stories of war. Unlike the empires that came after, obsessed with conquest, domination, and glory, the Minoans seemed more interested in trade, beauty, and ritual. Their frescoes show dancing figures, leaping bulls, and flowering landscapes. No battle scenes, no kings crowned in blood, no triumphs carved into stone. And then, they vanished. Around 1450 BCE, something happened. The great palace of Knossos, the heart of Minoan life, fell into decline. Other palatial centers across Crete were destroyed, suddenly, violently. Trade collapsed, cities emptied. Within a generation, the Minoans were gone. Not slowly, but seemingly all at once. So what happened? The most widely accepted theory points to a volcanic eruption. Around that same period, the nearby island of Thera, now known as Santorini, erupted with unimaginable force, one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. The eruption would have sent ash and gas into the sky for miles, darkening the sun. Massive tsunamis could have struck the coasts of Crete, wiping out harbors and settlements. Crops would have failed. Society, thrown into chaos, may have collapsed. And yet, something doesn't quite add up. Knossos, the greatest of the Minoan palaces, appears to have survived the initial eruption. Some of its structures remained standing long after. Its famous throne room still bears signs of use. So if the eruption was the beginning of the end, it wasn't the end itself. Enter the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, who shortly after the collapse began appearing on Crete in increasing numbers. Their art, their weapons, their influence began to overtake the Minoan world. It seems the Mycenaeans either conquered or absorbed what remained of the Minoans after the disaster. But the transition wasn't peaceful. There are signs of fire, destruction, and force. Archaeological layers show a sudden cultural shift. A civilization of open courtyards and ceremonial processions gave way to one of fortifications, warrior elites, and power politics. The peaceful society of Crete was not simply lost to nature, it was overwritten. Which raises a troubling question. Was the fall of the Minoans not just a natural disaster, but a historical cover-up? Think of it. An advanced, peaceful civilization disappears almost overnight, not only in practice but in memory. Their language, known as Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day. We cannot read their inscriptions. We don't know their real names, their songs, their prayers. We don't even know what they called themselves, and the ones who came after, the Mycenaeans and later the classical Greeks, absorbed their legacy, rebranded their symbols, and reshaped their myths. The labyrinth, for example, the maze said to hold the Minotaur, may have been a misunderstood description of the palace at Knossos, with its countless corridors and rooms. The beast within could have been a distorted memory of ritual bull-leaping ceremonies. And King Minos himself? Perhaps not a monster king, but a real ruler, recast by his successors into myth. The very act of mythologizing may have served as a kind of erasure, transforming what once was real into legend, untouchable, unprovable, and safely distant. In this way, the Minoans did not just fall, they were repurposed, absorbed into a Greek world that had no space for another, more ancient claim to greatness. So what remains? Ruins, frescoes, pottery. A language no one can read. A few echoes in the myths of Minos, Ariadne, and the bull-headed monster. And a haunting question. How much of what we call Greek was really Minoan in origin? And how much was quietly erased, the culture, the values, the very identity of a people, in order to make way for a more palatable narrative? History is written by survivors, but sometimes survival means obscuring the past you didn't want to remember. The Harappans, the forgotten people of peace. Long before the rise of Mesopotamia's grand empires or the dynasties of Egypt's Nile, another civilization flourished, quietly, steadily, and with a sense of order that would leave archaeologists baffled thousands of years later. It is known to us today as the Indus Valley Civilization, or more specifically, the Harappan Civilization, named after one of its first discovered cities. From around 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE, it stretched across what is now Pakistan, northwest India, and parts of Afghanistan. It was one of the largest civilizations of the ancient world, larger in territory than Egypt or Mesopotamia at their peak. Yet despite its size and sophistication, it left behind almost no evidence of war. The Harappans built vast cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, with remarkable precision. Streets ran in perfect grids. Houses were built to standard measurements. Every home, rich or poor, had access to advanced drainage systems with covered sewers and private bathing areas. Public wells dotted the cities. Even the bricks they used were standardized in size, suggesting some form of central regulation. Trade networks stretched as far as Mesopotamia. Harappan seals, small carved stones bearing mysterious symbols, have been found in Sumerian cities, proof of contact and commerce. They traded cotton textiles, beads, ceramics, and possibly precious stones. And yet, there is no sign of kings, no grand palaces, no statues glorifying rulers, no evidence of armies or mass fortifications. Even weapons are rare in the archaeological record. It is as if the Harappans had built a civilization that functioned without the trappings of constant warfare, something almost unheard of in the ancient world. But the mystery deepens. Their writing, a script found on thousands of seals and pottery fragments, remains undeciphered to this day. It is one of the great unsolved linguistic puzzles of history. Without the ability to read their words, we cannot know their myths, their laws, their poetry, or even what they called themselves. The name Harappan is a modern invention imposed upon them by archaeologists. Then, sometime after 1900 BCE, the civilization began to fade. Cities were abandoned, populations dispersed. By 1300 BCE, the great Harappan centers were gone. What caused the collapse? Some point to climate change. Evidence suggests the once mighty Saraswati River system dried up, while monsoon patterns shifted, making agriculture harder. Others suggest a series of devastating floods. Still others hint at a slow economic decline as trade routes shifted. And then there's the controversial theory of invasion, that Indo-Aryan migrants swept into the region, bringing with them new languages, rituals, and social structures that would later form the basis of Vedic culture in India. This idea, once dominant, is now contested. Many scholars argue there's no solid evidence of violent conquest, that the transition was gradual, a blending of cultures rather than a brutal takeover. Yet even if there was no war, the cultural shift was profound. Harappan traditions disappeared, their script was abandoned, their cities fell into ruin. Over time, memory of them faded so completely that by the time modern archaeology uncovered their remains in the 1920s, there was no trace of them in local folklore. They had not even survived as myth. That absence is striking. Other ancient peoples, the Sumerians, the Hittites, the Minoans, at least lived on in the stories of those who came after. The Harappans, forgotten entirely. It raises the question, was this just the natural erosion of memory? Or was there a reason their legacy vanished so completely? Some researchers speculate that later cultures may have had little interest in preserving the memory of a society that did not fit their hierarchical, warrior-dominated model. A civilization that appeared to function without kings or empires might have been seen as irrelevant or even threatening to those who ruled through power and conquest. Others suggest the Harappans may have guarded knowledge in engineering, agriculture, or governance that was lost with them, either through neglect or deliberate suppression. Today, we stand among their ruins and see the faint outlines of a way of life unlike anything else in the ancient world. We see order without tyranny, sophistication without monumental ego, but without their words, we may never know the full truth. Perhaps that is the greatest cover-up of all, not a deliberate conspiracy, but the silence of time itself. A silence that, for more than 3,000 years, allowed one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations to vanish almost completely, leaving behind nothing but bricks, seals, and the faint shadow of a different way to live. The Mycenaeans, the lost kings of bronze. When we think of ancient Greece, we imagine the marble temples of Athens, the philosophers in flowing robes, the legends of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But before this, Greece, before the Parthenon, before Socrates, there was another Greece, a darker, older, more primal civilization. They were the Mycenaeans, the warrior kings of the Bronze Age. From around 1600 BCE to 1100 BCE, the Mycenaeans ruled the Greek mainland and much of the Aegean. They built immense stone citadels, Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos, their walls so massive that later generations believed they had been constructed by giants, the mythical Cyclopes. These Cyclopean walls still stand today, their stones so huge that no one is quite sure how they were lifted into place. They were a people of palaces and power. Their kings were both warriors and rulers, controlling extensive trade networks that reached into Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant. Gold from their graves, weapons of bronze, and jars of precious oils and perfumes tell the story of a society rich in both wealth and ambition. Their script, Linear B, was an early form of Greek, the first written records in the Greek language. These clay tablets reveal inventories, religious offerings, and lists of goods. They tell of a bureaucratic world where palaces coordinated resources and oversaw every aspect of production. But the image we have of the Mycenaeans is also shaped by myth. It is in Homer's Iliad that we see them, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, leading 1,000 ships to lay siege to Troy. Whether the Trojan War happened exactly as described is debated, but archaeology suggests some kernel of truth. There were indeed conflicts between the Mycenaeans and the cities of Anatolia. And then suddenly, it was over. Around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean world began to unravel. Palaces were burned, trade collapsed, populations fled. Within a few decades, the great citadels were abandoned, and the linear B-script was forgotten. The Greek world entered a dark age that lasted for centuries, a time without writing, monumental building, or large-scale political organization. What caused this collapse remains one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Some point to natural disaster, earthquakes and droughts that crippled agriculture, others to external threats, the mysterious sea peoples, whose raids toppled empires across the eastern Mediterranean. Still others believe the Mycenaean system collapsed under its own weight, a network of interdependent kingdoms so tightly bound that when one fell, the rest followed. But there is another possibility, one rarely discussed outside specialist circles, the deliberate reshaping of memory. When Greece finally emerged from the Dark Age centuries later, the Mycenaeans were remembered only in legend. The new Greek city-states built their identities around democracy, philosophy, and the arts, not the centralized monarchies and warrior elites of the Mycenaean past. By turning the Mycenaeans into characters of myth, their true history could be safely romanticized and stripped of inconvenient truths. The palaces became the halls of Homeric kings. The Trojan War became a poetic epic rather than a record of real political conflict. The brutality, the destruction, and the fragility of the old order faded into the background. And so, what might have been a clear historical lineage became a blur. The Greeks of the classical era could claim the Mycenaean legacy when it suited them, but distance themselves from it when it did not. The physical evidence tells a different story. Archaeological digs show that the Mycenaeans were not just heroic kings and noble warriors. They were also ruthless rulers, demanding tribute from their subjects, waging war for resources, and enforcing strict hierarchies. They were skilled engineers and artists, but their world was not the golden age the myths suggest. It was a tense, militarized society balanced on a knife's edge. Perhaps this is why their memory was reshaped. Not erased entirely, but transformed into something more palatable, something that could serve as cultural inspiration without revealing the messy, complicated truth. In the end, the Mycenaeans' disappearance was total. Their writing system died, their trade networks vanished, their fortresses crumbled. For nearly 400 years, the Greek world existed without the tools and organization the Mycenaeans had once mastered. By the time writing returned, history had already become legend. And somewhere in that transformation, between the lines of Homer's verses and the stones of the Cyclopean walls, the true story of the Mycenaean kings was lost. The kingdom of Urartu, shadows beneath Armenia. High in the rugged mountains of the South Caucasus, where the borders of modern-day Armenia, Turkey, and Iran meet, there once stood a kingdom few people today have ever heard of. It was called Urartu. From the 9th to the 6th century BCE, Urartu was a formidable power in the ancient Near East, a rival to mighty Assyria. Its kings ruled from massive stone fortresses perched high above fertile valleys. Its engineers carved irrigation channels into unforgiving rock, bringing life to lands where farming should have been impossible. Its artisans crafted weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects of remarkable quality. At its height, Urartu controlled territory stretching from the Black Sea to Lake Urmia. The heart of the kingdom lay around Lake Van, where the capital fortress of Tushpa rose directly from a sheer cliff. From here, Urartian kings directed campaigns, managed trade, and oversaw a network of strongholds that guarded mountain passes and river valleys. Their language, unrelated to most others in the region, remains only partially understood. Their inscriptions, carved into cliffs and walls, speak of kings and victories, of temple dedications and divine blessings. The chief god, Haldi, was the patron of war and statehood, and his temples stood atop high platforms visible for miles. Yet, for all their power, the Urartians have all but disappeared from the story of the ancient world. Part of this is due to their rivals. The Assyrians, master propagandists of their time, recorded their wars in detail, but always from their own perspective. When they wrote of Urartu, it was to boast of victories or to depict them as obstacles to be overcome. Rarely was Urartu described as a center of culture or innovation, and when Urartu finally fell in the 6th century BCE, there was no single catastrophic event recorded in surviving history. Instead, they seem to have been gradually absorbed by new powers, first by the Medes, then by the Achaemenid Persians. Their fortresses were reused, their cities renamed, their cultural identity slowly overwritten. This process, the quiet erasure through assimilation, is one of the most effective forms of historical disappearance. When a kingdom is conquered violently, its memory often lives on in the songs and stories of survivors. But when its people merge gradually into the next ruling culture, that distinct identity can vanish within a few generations. By the time Greek historians like Herodotus wrote about the region, Urartu was no longer a name in common use. Instead, the land was known as Armenia, and its people as Armenians, a continuity in population, perhaps, but not in recorded history. The name Urartu itself was forgotten for over 2,000 years until rediscovered in the 19th century by archaeologists working among the ruins near Lake Van. Why did Urartu disappear so completely from the record? Some historians suggest it was simply geography and politics. The kingdom was small compared to the great empires that followed, and so its story was swallowed by theirs. But others believe the erasure was deliberate, a way for the conquerors to solidify their own legitimacy by cutting ties to the power that had come before. There are hints that Urartu may have been more advanced in certain areas than its rivals admitted. Its irrigation systems, some still in use today, are a testament to engineering skill far ahead of its time. Its fortresses, with walls that seem to grow from the living rock, show a mastery of construction in difficult terrain. Even its art, intricate bronze shields, finely crafted helmets, and ritual vessels, suggests a culture of refinement, not just military strength. And yet, none of this made it into the grand narratives of ancient history. Today, the ruins of Urartu lie scattered across high plateaus and mountain ridges. Many are unmarked, unprotected, and unknown outside specialist circles. The few inscriptions we have tell us little about daily life, beliefs, or the worldview of the Urartian people. What we know is fragmentary, and perhaps that was the intention. In the grand sweep of history, Urartu is a reminder of how easily a culture can be buried, not under ash or rubble, but under layers of new names, new rulers, and new maps. It did not die in a blaze of glory. It was not memorialized in epic poetry. It was simply absorbed until even its name was gone. And if Urartu, a kingdom that rivaled Assyria, built monumental works, and shaped the land it ruled, could vanish so completely from memory, we must ask, how many others have done the same? And how much of our ancient past is hidden not by accident, but by design? Göbekli Tepe, the first temple hidden for millennia. In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, beneath layers of soil and centuries of silence, lies a site that has forced historians to rethink the story of human civilization. Its name is Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and it is, by current evidence, the oldest known monumental structure in the world. The discovery began in the mid-1990s when archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the site, which locals had long known as a hill covered in loose stone. Earlier surveys had dismissed it as a medieval cemetery, but as Schmidt examined the scattered fragments of carved limestone, he realized this was something far older and far stranger than anyone had imagined. Excavations revealed towering T-shaped pillars, some over 16 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The stones were arranged in great circles connected by low walls. Many of the pillars were carved with intricate reliefs: foxes, boars, snakes, birds, lions, a veritable menagerie of ancient life. These were not crude scratchings, they were sophisticated works of art. The shock came with the dating. Radiocarbon analysis showed Göbekli Tepe was built around 9,600 BCE, over 11,000 years ago. That's 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, 6,000 years older than the pyramids, and thousands of years before the invention of pottery, writing, or the wheel. According to the standard timeline of human development, nothing like this should have existed. The people of that era were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile bands. They were not supposed to organize massive labor forces to quarry, transport, and erect multi-ton stone pillars. They were not supposed to create monumental art. They were certainly not supposed to build what appears to be a massive ceremonial complex, and yet there it is, buried beneath the earth for millennia. Which raises the first great mystery. Why was Göbekli Tepe buried at all? Unlike most ancient sites, which are covered over by time and neglect, Göbekli Tepe seems to have been deliberately backfilled. Sometime around 8000 BCE, the people who built it covered its stone circles with tons of soil and debris, entombing the site. No one knows why. Was it to protect the structures, to mark the end of a sacred era, or was there something about Göbekli Tepe that later generations wanted hidden? The second mystery is the purpose of the site itself. There are no signs of permanent settlement, no hearths, no houses, no fields. This was not a village. It was something else entirely. Perhaps a temple, perhaps a gathering place for seasonal rituals, perhaps even a center for a regional cult. If so, it means the very idea of organized religion may have emerged long before agriculture, reversing the old assumption that farming created large, settled communities, which then led to religion and monumental architecture. Here, the sequence may have been the opposite: religion first, agriculture later. The implications are staggering. It suggests that the human capacity for symbolic thought, for cooperation on a massive scale, for shaping the landscape according to spiritual vision, existed far earlier than we believed. And yet, for all its importance, Göbekli Tepe remained unknown for most of human history. Covered by earth for thousands of years, it escaped both destruction and memory. The world forgot it completely. No myths, no legends, no folk stories about a great stone temple survive in the region. It was as if the site had been erased from the cultural mind. This leads some to wonder, was Göbekli Tepe's burial truly accidental? Or was there a conscious effort to remove it from view and thus from memory? A deliberate covering could suggest the end of a belief system, replaced by something new, perhaps less centralized, perhaps more controlled. Or it could point to some catastrophe, an event that rendered the site taboo. Mainstream archaeology offers more practical explanations: climate change, shifts in population, the eventual adoption of farming in nearby valleys. But even these do not fully explain why such an enormous and sacred complex would be so thoroughly hidden. Today, excavations have revealed only a fraction of the site. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that dozens more stone circles remain buried. What secrets they hold, carvings, alignments, perhaps even inscriptions, are still unknown. For now, Göbekli Tepe stands as a paradox. The oldest temple we know of, built by people who were supposedly too primitive to build temples. A monument to the complexity of the human mind, hidden for reasons we can only guess, and in that gap between what we can measure and what we can only imagine lies the possibility that the story of human civilization is far older and far stranger than we have been told. Baalbek, the megaliths too heavy to move. In the Bekaa Valley of modern-day Lebanon stands one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world, the ancient city of Baalbek. Today it is best known for its Roman temples, especially the Grand Temple of Jupiter, whose towering columns still dominate the skyline. But beneath and around these Roman ruins lies something far older and far stranger. Baalbek's history stretches back thousands of years. The site was sacred long before the Romans arrived in the 1st century BCE. Phoenicians, and possibly even earlier cultures, worshipped here. But what captures the imagination are not the temples themselves. It's the massive stone platform on which they stand. This platform contains some of the largest worked stones ever quarried by humans. Along the western wall of the Temple of Jupiter are 3 colossal blocks known as the Trilithon. Each measures about 19 meters, 62 feet in length, 4.3 meters, 14 feet in height, and 3.6 meters, 12 feet in width. Each one is estimated to weigh around 800 tons, and they are not lying in a quarry. They are fitted perfectly into place, lifted more than 20 feet above the ground, with joints so precise that a knife blade cannot fit between them. Nearby, in the quarry just outside the ancient city, lies an even larger stone, the stone of the pregnant woman. It weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. In 2014, archaeologists uncovered yet another stone beneath it, estimated at over 1,650 tons, and the largest known carved stone block in the world. Here's the mystery. No known ancient culture, including the Romans, had the technology to lift and position such massive stones with that level of precision. The Romans were master builders, but their engineering feats relied on smaller, more manageable blocks, arches, and concrete. They did not move megaliths of this size. So, who did, and when? Some historians suggest these stones predate the Roman occupation by thousands of years, perhaps to a time when the site was part of a much older, unknown culture. The Romans, in this view, simply built their temples on top of an existing megalithic foundation, reusing a platform whose origins were already ancient. But if true, that only deepens the puzzle. What tools could have shaped, transported, and placed stones of such magnitude? How could a pre-industrial society move objects heavier than a modern locomotive across uneven terrain and raise them into position without cranes or steel? Mainstream archaeology offers theories. The stones may have been moved with wooden rollers, levers, and ramps, using massive labor forces over long periods of time. Some believe the Romans themselves quarried and placed them using ingenious but now lost engineering techniques. Yet no surviving Roman text mentions such an extraordinary achievement at Baalbek, a strange omission, given their pride in public works. Then there is the question of why. Why use stones so large when smaller blocks would have been easier to work with? Monumentalism has always been part of architecture, but these stones seem to go far beyond the practical needs of construction. They suggest either a ceremonial significance or a level of ambition, perhaps even competition, that we no longer understand. Over the centuries, Baalbek's origin myths have multiplied. Arab traditions linked it to giants, claiming it was built before the Great Flood. Medieval writers connected it to the biblical figure of Nimrod. In more recent times, it has even been claimed as evidence of lost technology or ancient advanced civilizations. Theories dismissed by most scholars, but still compelling to those who see the stones as an unsolved riddle. What is not in dispute is that Baalbek was a site of continuous importance for millennia. Its layers of history, so from pre-Phoenician cult site to Roman temple complex to Byzantine church to Islamic fortress, make it difficult to separate one era from another. Each generation built on the remains of the last, often erasing or repurposing what came before. And perhaps that is the real cover-up here. Not a conspiracy in the modern sense, but the gradual loss of memory caused by centuries of rebuilding, conquest, and reinterpretation. The culture that first raised the trilithon left no written record of how or why they did it. Later peoples built their own monuments on the same spot, layering their own stories over the past. Today, the megaliths of Baalbek remain where they have stood for untold ages. Tourists walk among them, dwarfed by their size, marveling at the impossible scale. But no one can say with certainty who first laid them there, or what knowledge was lost when their true builders passed into history without a name. The Olmec heads, faces from a forgotten world. On the humid Gulf Coast of modern-day Mexico in the states of Veracruz and Tabasco lies some of the most enigmatic artifacts of the ancient Americas, the colossal stone heads of the Olmec civilization. Each one is carved from a single massive block of basalt, weighing between 6 and 40 tons. The tallest stands over 3 meters, 10 feet high. Their features are bold and individualized. Broad noses, thick lips, strong jaws, eyes that seem to watch you as you pass. No two are the same. They are not generic depictions of a people, but portraits. And yet, we have no written record of who they represent. The Olmec civilization flourished roughly between 1500 BCE and 400 BCE, centuries before the rise of the Maya, and more than a millennium before the Aztec Empire. They are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, for they seem to have laid the foundations for many later traditions, ceremonial centers, ball games, monumental art, and complex religious symbolism. But the Olmecs themselves remain shadowy. They left no deciphered writing, only a few symbols and possible glyphs. What we know of them comes from archaeology, from the ruins of cities like San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, and from the great stone heads. The basalt used for these heads came from distant volcanic ranges, sometimes over 60 miles away. Transporting such massive stones without the wheel, without beasts of burden, and across swampy, river-cut terrain is a feat that still challenges modern engineers to explain. Once quarried, the stones were shaped with stone tools, hammered and polished into their final form. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The proportions are accurate, the contours smooth, the expressions vivid. Whoever carved them had deep skill and the resources to dedicate massive amounts of time and labor to the work. But the greatest mystery is why they were made. Most scholars believe they depict rulers immortalizing their likeness in stone, perhaps to serve as guardians of ceremonial centers. The individuality of each head supports this, but if so, where are the inscriptions naming them? Where are the texts telling their deeds? In the absence of written records, we are left to guess. Some suggest the heads had religious significance, representing gods or deified ancestors. Others believe they were political symbols, meant to project authority over a region. Then there are the more controversial theories, that the heads depict people from distant lands, perhaps even across oceans. This speculation comes from their facial features, which some perceive as distinct from other Mesoamerican depictions. Mainstream archaeology rejects these claims, arguing that the features are within the range of native diversity, but the debate illustrates how easily a lack of written history invites interpretation. Adding to the enigma is the fact that many of the heads were deliberately buried. At San Lorenzo, the great sculptures were toppled, defaced, and interred under layers of earth and debris. This happened centuries before the arrival of Europeans, suggesting the destruction was carried out by other Mesoamerican peoples, perhaps as part of a political shift, a conquest, or a rejection of Olmec rule. In this, we see a familiar pattern in history, the deliberate erasure of the past by those who follow. To destroy the monuments of a people is to strip them of power, to sever their connection to the land, to ensure their story fades from memory. By the time the Maya and Aztec civilizations rose, the Olmecs had already been gone for nearly 1,000 years. To these later cultures, the colossal heads may have been ancient relics, the work of a people known only through faint legend. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that modern archaeology rediscovered them, and even then, they were met with skepticism. The first reports were dismissed as exaggerations. Surely no such massive sculptures could exist in the jungles of Mexico. It took decades before their significance was fully acknowledged. Today, 17 colossal heads are known, scattered among museum collections and archaeological parks. But their full story remains untold. Who the Olmecs truly were, how they organized their society, why they chose to carve these massive portraits, and why they buried them, are questions that still hang in the humid air of their homeland. Perhaps that is the greatest testament to their legacy. The heads remain, defiant and silent, staring out from the deep past, and in their stony silence, they remind us that whole civilizations can rise, flourish, and vanish, leaving behind only fragments, daring the future to piece the truth together. Stonehenge, the monument that defies its age. On the windswept Salisbury Plain in southern England, a ring of giant stones stands against the sky. Weathered and silent, they have watched more than 4,000 years of human history pass by. This is Stonehenge, perhaps the most famous prehistoric monument in the world, and yet one of the least understood. The structure we see today is the final stage of a complex site that evolved over more than 1,000 years. The earliest phase began around 3000 BCE, when a circular earthwork enclosure was dug into the chalk. Inside, wooden posts or stones may have once stood. Over time, larger and larger stones were brought in, some from as far as 150 miles away in Wales. There are two main types of stones at Stonehenge. The sarsens, massive sandstone blocks weighing up to 25 tons, were likely sourced from the Marlborough Downs about 20 miles to the north. Then there are the bluestones, smaller but still weighing up to 4 tons each, which came from the Preseli Hills in Wales. How these stones were transported, without the wheel, across rivers and rugged terrain, remains one of the monument's enduring mysteries. Archaeologists have proposed timber sledges, rollers, and rafts, but the logistics would have required enormous coordination, manpower, and planning. The very decision to bring the stones from such distant locations suggests that their source mattered as much as their placement, perhaps imbued with spiritual or cultural significance. The arrangement of the stones is equally deliberate. Alignments with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset suggest an astronomical function, marking the turning points of the year. But Stonehenge was more than a calendar. Excavations have revealed cremated human remains dating to its earliest phase, indicating it was also a burial site. Later, it may have served as a gathering place for rituals, feasts, and ceremonies linking the living and the dead. The mystery deepens when we consider Stonehenge in the context of its surrounding landscape. The plain is dotted with barrows, cursus monuments, and other earthworks, forming a ceremonial complex that stretched for miles. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed dozens of hidden features beneath the soil, avenues, pits, and other stone circles, suggesting that Stonehenge was just one part of a vast ritual center. And yet, despite decades of study, we still do not know exactly who built it or why. The builders left no written records. By the time Roman writers encountered the site, it was already ancient, its origins unknown. Medieval legends attributed it to Merlin the wizard, who supposedly transported the stones from Ireland using magic. Others believed it was the work of giants. Modern archaeology has offered more grounded explanations, linking the monument to the Neolithic peoples of Britain and their descendants in the early Bronze Age. But here, too, questions remain. Why invest such immense labor into a site that shows no signs of everyday habitation? Why bring stones from so far away when closer sources were available? Why realign and rebuild it multiple times over centuries? Some suggest Stonehenge was a place of healing, its bluestones believed to have curative powers. Others see it as a unifying project, a monument built to bring together different tribes in shared purpose. Still others believe it marked a liminal space between the worlds of the living and the ancestors. The idea of a cover-up here is subtle. No one deliberately erased Stonehenge from history. The stones remain, after all, but its original meaning was lost long before the first medieval chronicler put pen to parchment. Whatever songs were sung here, whatever rituals were performed, whatever myths were told beneath the midsummer dawn, they were never written down. As new peoples came to Britain, Celts, Romans, Saxons, Normans, Stonehenge was reinterpreted again and again, stripped of its true context and woven into new narratives. And so, the stones endure as an enigma. Tourists stand before them, marveling at their size, their age, their mystery. Archaeologists dig and measure, uncovering dates and alignments, but still unable to answer the central question. What was this place to the people who built it? Perhaps that is why Stonehenge continues to fascinate. It resists being fully explained. It is both a monument and a message whose language has been forgotten, whose meaning lies just out of reach. In that sense, Stonehenge is not just a relic of the Neolithic. It is a reminder that even the most enduring works of humanity can lose their story, and that sometimes the past hides in plain sight. Yonaguni, the sunken ruins beneath the sea. Off the southern coast of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, in the warm waters of the East China Sea, lies a submerged structure that has puzzled divers, archaeologists, and geologists for decades. It is known simply as the Yonaguni Monument, a vast, stepped formation of stone rising from the ocean floor like the remains of a drowned city. The story begins in 1986 when a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan's westernmost island. While scanning the seabed, he came upon an astonishing sight: massive terraces, broad platforms, perfectly straight edges, and towering walls that seemed too precise to be natural. The formation stretched over 150 meters, 490 feet in length, with some sections rising as high as 25 meters, 82 feet, from the seabed. Photographs and video of the site quickly drew international attention. Some saw in its shapes the unmistakable signs of human craftsmanship: right angles, flat surfaces, staircases, and geometric patterns that resembled the stonework of ancient temples or pyramids. One feature in particular, dubbed the Grand Staircase, appears to consist of wide, evenly spaced steps leading up a sloping terrace. Another section, called the Stage, resembles a large ceremonial platform. Elsewhere, there are what look like roads, channels, and even carvings, including, according to some reports, an animal figure resembling a turtle. But the monument lies under 5 to 25 meters of water, making study difficult, and here is where the mystery deepens. If these structures were made by humans, they must date back to a time before the sea rose to cover them. That would place their construction at least 10,000 years ago during the last ice age, thousands of years earlier than the accepted timeline for complex architecture in East Asia. This possibility is both thrilling and controversial. Mainstream archaeology is deeply cautious about rewriting history on the basis of one site. Many geologists argue that the Yonaguni Monument is entirely natural, the product of sandstone's tendency to fracture along straight lines, creating blocky, terraced shapes through erosion and tectonic activity. They point to similar formations elsewhere in the world, formed without human intervention. Proponents of the human-made theory counter that while natural processes can produce straight lines, they rarely create the combination of right angles, uniform steps, and large-scale symmetry seen here. They also note that Yonaguni lies near the ancient Okinawan island cultures, which may have had maritime traditions capable of sophisticated stonework long before recorded history. There is another layer to the debate. If Yonaguni was built by humans, then its submersion must have coincided with the end of the Ice Age, when melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically. This would imply that an entire coastal culture, perhaps a trading network or ceremonial center, was drowned and forgotten, its memory lost to all later inhabitants of the islands. The lack of artifacts has been a stumbling block for the human-made theory. No pottery, tools, or human remains have been conclusively linked to the site. Without these, proving intentional construction is almost impossible. However, some divers claim to have seen smaller carved stones and symbols nearby, though these have not been thoroughly documented or accepted in peer-reviewed research. The Yonaguni Monument is more than just a geological puzzle. It has become a symbol of the tension between orthodox history and the tantalizing hints of a deeper, older human story. If it is natural, it still stands as one of the most spectacular underwater formations in the world. If it is human-made, it could represent one of the oldest known works of monumental architecture, predating even Göbekli Tepe. What makes Yonaguni especially intriguing is the near-total absence of cultural memory surrounding it. Local legends speak vaguely of lost lands and ancient kingdoms swallowed by the sea, but no clear oral tradition describes the monument itself. It is as if, when the waters rose, they erased not just the stones from view, but the very knowledge of their existence. Today, Yonaguni remains in a kind of interpretive limbo. Japanese authorities have not declared it a protected archaeological site, partly because of the ongoing debate over its origins. Divers from around the world visit it for its beauty, its mystery, and the strange sense of standing at the edge of two worlds, the known and the unknown. Whether shaped entirely by nature or by the hands of a forgotten people, the Yonaguni Monument forces us to confront the limits of our historical timeline. It asks a question we cannot yet answer. If there was once a civilization here sophisticated enough to carve in stone at this scale, what else might lie hidden beneath the waves, waiting for us to find it? The phantom time. Hypothesis: centuries that never happened. History feels solid. We think of it as a chain of events, each linked to the one before, a continuous timeline stretching from the present into the deep past. We measure it in centuries, anchored by documents, inscriptions, and artifacts. But what if parts of that timeline were invented? This is the premise of the phantom time hypothesis, a controversial theory proposed in 1991 by German historian Herbert Illig. Illig's startling claim: nearly 300 years of the Middle Ages, roughly 614 to 911 CE, never actually happened. According to him, the calendar was artificially extended, and the early Middle Ages, as we know them, are, to a large degree, a historical fabrication. The idea sounds outrageous, yet Illig pointed to what he saw as troubling gaps and inconsistencies in the historical record of that period. First, the scarcity of reliable documentation. Compared to the centuries before and after, the years between 600 and 900 CE produce fewer surviving texts, fewer records of events, and fewer advances in architecture or technology in Europe. Illig argued that this dark period was suspiciously uneventful. Second, anomalies in architecture and archaeology. He claimed that certain styles appear to jump abruptly in development, as if several centuries of gradual change had been skipped. For example, Romanesque architecture traditionally dated to the 10th century, appears without clear transitional forms from earlier styles. Third, calendrical adjustments. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, correcting an error in the Julian calendar that had accumulated over centuries. Illig calculated that the correction made sense if the Julian calendar had been in use for about 1,300 years, but not if it had truly been in place since 45 BCE. The implication, the timeline was artificially lengthened. So how, according to Illig, did this phantom time come to be? He suggested a conspiracy involving the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Their motive, to place themselves in the millennial year of 1000 CE, giving their reigns symbolic and prophetic significance. By adding centuries to the calendar, they could claim to live in an age of divine importance. Under this theory, historical figures such as Charlemagne were either exaggerated composites or entirely fictitious. The grand deeds attributed to them were, in reality, fabricated to fill the invented centuries. Mainstream historians reject Illig's hypothesis, citing multiple lines of evidence for the existence of the disputed centuries. These include dendrochronology, tree ring dating, radiocarbon dating, and records from outside Europe, notably from China and the Islamic world, which align with the traditional timeline. Still, the phantom time hypothesis persists in popular imagination, partly because it's provocative, but also because it touches on a deeper truth. History is not a neutral record. It is compiled, edited, and sometimes distorted by those with power. And even if Illig's specific claim is incorrect, the broader possibility that parts of the historical record have been manipulated is far from unthinkable. We know that medieval rulers commissioned flattering chronicles, erased their enemies from records, and forged documents to bolster their claims. What makes the theory unsettling is that it challenges the very structure of our understanding of time. If a stretch of centuries could be fabricated, how much of what we think we know about the past depends on trust? Trust in the records, trust in the keepers of those records, trust in the continuity of the calendar itself? The debate over phantom time also reminds us that our certainty about history often rests on layers of interpretation. Artifacts must be dated. Texts must be translated. Chronologies must be reconciled across cultures. At each step, there is room for error, bias, or manipulation. Perhaps this is why the phantom time hypothesis continues to fascinate. It doesn't need to be true to serve its purpose. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How secure is the timeline we accept? Could it be altered without our knowing? And if history can be rewritten, could it also be invented? In the end, Illig's phantom centuries may not exist, but the shadow they cast, the possibility that the calendar we live by is itself a constructed narrative, lingers. And in that shadow, the boundaries between history, myth, and deliberate fiction grow thinner than we might like to admit. The calendar reform of Pope Gregory XIII, a disappearance in time. In the autumn of 1582, something extraordinary happened across much of Catholic Europe. People went to bed on Thursday, October 4th, and woke up the next morning to find it was Friday, October 15th. 10 days had simply vanished. This was not a supernatural event, but a deliberate act of governance. The introduction of the Gregorian calendar by Pope Gregory XIII. The reform was designed to fix a problem that had been creeping into European life for more than a millennium, the slow drift of the calendar away from the solar year. The old Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE, assumed a year was exactly 365.25 days long, but the true solar year is about 11 minutes shorter. Over centuries, those extra minutes added up. By the 1500s, the spring equinox was occurring around March 11th instead of March 21st, a 10-day shift that was throwing off the calculation of Easter and other church festivals. Gregory's reform made two major changes. It dropped 10 days from the calendar to realign it with the seasons. It altered the leap year rule, making the calendar more accurate going forward. From a purely astronomical standpoint, this was a rational, even necessary adjustment. But for many, it was deeply unsettling. Imagine losing 10 days of your life overnight, days that had been planned, lived for, expected. Farmers were unsure when to plant, merchants worried about contracts. In some regions, riots broke out as people feared they had been robbed of a portion of their wages or rents. The change also wasn't adopted everywhere at once. Catholic countries implemented it immediately: Spain, Portugal, Italy, Poland. But Protestant states were suspicious, seeing it as a papal plot. England, for example, refused to adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752, by which time the gap had grown to 11 days. Russia waited until after the 1917 revolution. This delay created a strange situation. For centuries, different countries were living by different dates. An event that happened on October 10th in one country might be September 30th in another. International diplomacy, trade, and science were thrown into confusion, and here's where the idea of a cover-up or manipulation enters the story. The Gregorian reform is often presented as a neutral, scientific fix, but in practice it was also a consolidation of papal authority over time itself. For centuries, the Church had controlled not just spiritual life, but the very structure of the calendar, the rhythm by which societies worked, traded, and celebrated. By deciding when the year truly began and ended, the papacy exercised immense soft power. The sudden erasure of days raises deeper philosophical questions. If entire dates can be officially removed from history, what else might be altered or rewritten without the average person ever being able to verify it? The missing days of October 1582 were acknowledged and recorded, but what if other adjustments, smaller and subtler, were made and not announced? In some circles, the calendar reform is linked to broader theories about historical manipulation, including the idea that our chronology has been stretched or compressed in ways we don't fully realize. The fact that the Church could simply declare certain days non-existent is a reminder of how fluid the measurement of time can be when controlled by human institutions. It's also worth noting that calendars are, at their core, cultural agreements. They are not natural laws. They are systems invented by humans to keep track of days, months, and years. And throughout history, those systems have been altered for political, religious, and economic reasons. For the people of 1582, the change was both disruptive and, for many, disturbing. To them, the 10 days weren't imaginary. They were part of their lived experience. A wedding planned for October 7th now fell on October 17th. Birthdays skipped forward. Legal deadlines shifted overnight. The reform may have been scientifically sound, but it was also an assertion that authority could literally rewrite the passage of time. Today, the Gregorian calendar is so entrenched that we rarely think about its origins. We assume the way we measure time is fixed, objective, and universal. But the missing days of 1582 are a reminder that timekeeping is a human construct, one that can be reshaped, condensed, or extended at will. And when those with power control the calendar, they control more than just the dates. They control the framework within which history itself unfolds. Shifting chronicles, the war of timelines between Rome and the Mongols. History is only as stable as the records that preserve it. But when those records disagree, who decides which version becomes truth? One of the strangest patterns in historical research is the discrepancy between timelines recorded in different parts of the world, especially when comparing the histories of Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. In some cases, events that should align perfectly between civilizations appear to happen at different times, or not at all. A striking example emerges when historians attempt to reconcile the chronicles of the Roman Empire with those of the Mongol Empire, separated by more than a millennium, but linked through Eurasian history's vast continuity. While these civilizations did not exist simultaneously, the way their histories are structured, and the gaps between them, raise uncomfortable questions about how chronology was established. The issue is not a literal overlap of Rome and the Mongols, but the methods by which their timelines were constructed and connected to one another. Medieval European chroniclers often placed events in a framework built on biblical dating, Roman imperial records, and church history. Chinese and Persian sources used entirely different systems: dynastic reigns, sexagenary cycles, lunar calendars. When modern scholars attempted to weave these separate threads into a single global timeline, they encountered contradictions. Certain astronomical events, like eclipses mentioned in Chinese sources, did not align perfectly with European calculations. Battles described in Islamic chronicles appeared to happen out of sync with equivalent events in Western dating. Some records seem to be duplicated under different names, suggesting either independent retelling of the same events or deliberate double counting to create a longer historical span. The most extreme interpretations of these discrepancies come from proponents of alternative chronologies, researchers like Anatoly Fomenko, who argue that large portions of history were duplicated or artificially lengthened. Fomenko's theory controversially suggests that the histories of Rome, Byzantium, and parts of the Mongol Empire may in fact be distorted reflections of the same events, shifted in time and retold under new names. Mainstream historians reject these sweeping claims, pointing instead to errors in translation, copyist mistakes, and the difficulty of synchronizing records from vastly different cultures. But even the orthodox view admits that early chronology was often fluid and subject to revision. Why would anyone alter historical timelines? The answer is power. Chronology is not just about dates, it's about legitimacy. Medieval rulers justified their authority by linking themselves to ancient empires. If that meant stretching genealogies, inserting legendary figures, or redating events to make their reigns align with prophetic years, so be it. For example, in Europe, the Church's universal chronology was designed to show the unbroken flow of history from creation to Christ to the present day. In China, imperial chronologies emphasized the cyclical mandate of heaven and sought to portray each new dynasty as the rightful successor to an eternal order. In the Islamic world, historians tied events to the Hijri calendar, anchored in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, framing history through a religious lens. When such politically shaped timelines are later merged into one global history, the seams don't always match. Gaps appear, overlaps occur. And in some cases, centuries seem curiously empty or doubled, a hint that events may have been moved, renamed, or even invented to fill chronological holes. The Mongol Empire in particular illustrates this problem. Spanning from the Pacific to Eastern Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, it linked dozens of cultures into one vast network. But many local histories seem to integrate the Mongols differently, compressing or expanding their influence depending on local politics. Some chronicles describe Mongol campaigns in detail, others barely mention them at all, as if erasing the humiliation of conquest. Likewise, the later Roman Empire's history, especially in its Byzantine form, was heavily re-edited by later generations. Victories were exaggerated, defeats downplayed, rulers recast as saints or villains, depending on the needs of the present. When we place these timelines side by side, Rome's carefully curated imperial history and the Mongol Empire's often fragmentary and region-specific accounts, we're left with a troubling realization. The continuous timeline we take for granted is the product of negotiation, compromise, and, at times, outright manipulation. It may not be that centuries were invented wholesale, as the most radical theories suggest, but there is little doubt that chronology was, and still is, a political tool, shaped by those who needed the past to serve the present. This means that when we look at history's grand narrative from the legions of Rome to the horsemen of the Mongol steppes, we're seeing not a perfect mirror of reality, but a tapestry with threads spliced, shifted, and dyed to suit the weaver's design. And in the gaps between those threads, there may be whole truths we've never been allowed to see. The New Chronology of Anatoly Fomenko, History Compressed. In the late 20th century, a Russian mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko put forward one of the most provocative and polarizing theories in modern historical debate. He called it the New Chronology, and its central claim was nothing less than this: most of recorded history before the 17th century is a fabrication. According to Fomenko, entire eras, thousands of years' worth, were either duplicated under different names or invented outright. The timeline of human civilization, as he saw it, had been compressed into a much shorter span, with many of the events we think of as ancient actually occurring in the medieval period. Fomenko's journey into historical revision began not as a historian, but as a specialist in applied mathematics. Using statistical analysis of texts, astronomical calculations, and pattern recognition, he claimed to find suspicious similarities between different historical accounts. For example, stories of certain ancient rulers seemed to echo the lives of medieval kings almost point for point. Descriptions of major battles in supposedly distant eras matched in troop numbers, tactics, and outcomes. Astronomical references in ancient chronicles, such as recorded eclipses or planetary alignments, often didn't match the dates assigned by mainstream historians, but fit better with much later ones. From these observations, Fomenko concluded that many ancient events were simply retellings of the same episodes under different names, often shifted hundreds of years earlier in official chronology. One of his most shocking assertions was that the histories of ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt are largely fictional reconstructions created during the Renaissance. He argued that these civilizations, in the form we know them, never existed in such remote antiquity. Their supposed events were, in his view, distorted versions of medieval European and Byzantine history. Fomenko's theory also reimagined the so-called Dark Ages. Where traditional history sees a long medieval stagnation between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, Fomenko saw an artificially inserted gap, centuries that either didn't happen or were filled with duplicated events to extend the timeline. Why would anyone create such an elaborate fabrication? Fomenko suggested that much of the false chronology was constructed in the 16th and 17th centuries by the Catholic Church, particularly by Jesuit scholars, in order to assert religious authority and connect contemporary Europe to an ancient, glorious past that would legitimize its dominance. Unsurprisingly, the academic establishment has overwhelmingly rejected the new chronology. Historians point out that archaeological evidence, new from carbon dating to dendrochronology, supports the conventional timeline. They accuse Fomenko of cherry-picking similarities, ignoring contradictory evidence, and misinterpreting ancient sources. His astronomical recalculations, critics argue, rely on selective data and flawed assumptions. Yet despite this, the theory has gained a dedicated following, especially among those suspicious of institutional authority. A part of its appeal lies in its boldness. It does not merely suggest that history has errors. It claims that the entirety of our historical foundation is suspect. Fomenko's work spans thousands of pages with dense statistical charts and diagrams attempting to map overlapping timelines. In his reconstructed history, the biblical events, the Crusades, and even the Mongol invasions all occurred much later than believed, sometimes collapsed into a single tangled set of conflicts. Even if the new chronology is wrong in its specifics, it raises an unsettling point. The official timeline of history was not handed down intact from the past. It was assembled, and in many cases assembled centuries after the events it describes. This leaves room for error, bias, and deliberate manipulation. It also touches on a deeper psychological truth. Most of us never personally verify the evidence for ancient history. We take the existence of Rome, the antiquity of the pyramids, or the dating of Chinese dynasties on trust. And where trust exists, so does the potential for abuse. For many, that's the real draw of Fomenko's theory. Not that it proves we've been lied to for centuries, but that it reminds us how dependent we are on the keepers of the historical record. The Chinese dynastic drift, problems in synchronizing East and West. When historians attempt to build a unified picture of world history, they rely on synchronizing different civilizations' timelines, aligning events recorded in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia into a single chronological framework. But the deeper we go into the past, the harder this becomes. And nowhere is the challenge more evident than in the long and complex history of imperial China. For over 2 millennia, Chinese historians recorded their past through dynastic chronicles, official histories compiled under each ruling house. These works, like the Records of the Grand Historian or the Book of Han, served not only as historical records, but also as instruments of state ideology. They reinforced the concept of the mandate of heaven, the belief that a dynasty ruled with divine approval until corruption or disaster proved otherwise, justifying its replacement. This system created a continuous narrative from the semi-mythical Xia dynasty through the Shang and Zhou, all the way to the last imperial dynasty, the Qing. On paper, it is one of the longest unbroken historical traditions in the world. But the reality is far more complicated. First, each new dynasty had a vested interest in legitimizing its rule. That meant portraying its immediate predecessors as corrupt and unworthy, while linking itself to the great rulers of the distant past. In practice, this could involve reshaping the historical record, exaggerating flaws, omitting successes, and in some cases, inserting or shifting events to create a desired lineage. Second, China's historical record was entirely self-contained for most of its existence. Foreign events were rarely recorded unless they directly affected China through trade, diplomacy, or conflict. This means that aligning Chinese history with that of Rome, Persia, or medieval Europe depends on a handful of known astronomical events, diplomatic exchanges, or shared records of eclipses, comets, and other natural phenomena. Here lies the problem. When scholars compare these anchor points between East and West, discrepancies emerge. For example, certain astronomical events mentioned in Chinese chronicles, such as eclipses or planetary conjunctions, sometimes don't match the calculated dates they should correspond to, given the standard Western timeline. In some cases, the events appear to be centuries off. Are these copyist errors, misinterpretations by later historians, or signs that the dating systems themselves have drifted in ways we don't fully understand? Complicating matters further is the Chinese sexagenary cycle, a 60-year rotating system of year names. While it was a precise method for marking years within China, it had to be anchored to an absolute calendar date to match foreign records. If that anchor point was ever shifted, intentionally or accidentally, entire blocks of history could slide forward or backward in relation to the West. Then there's the matter of lost records. Fires, invasions, and deliberate purges destroyed countless historical documents over the centuries. The infamous burning of books and burying of scholars under the Qin dynasty 3rd century BCE is only the most famous example. Later dynasties also destroyed or heavily edited records that contradicted their official narrative. The result is that many early Chinese events are known only from sources compiled centuries after the fact. Some alternative historians have suggested that parts of the Chinese timeline may have been extended or compressed to fit political needs. For example, the legendary Xia dynasty, which supposedly ruled from around 2070 BCE to 1600 BCE, has little direct archaeological evidence, leading some to suspect it may be partly mythical or its dating exaggerated to create a longer imperial tradition. Even in more recent history, synchronizing events is not straightforward. The Mongol Yuan dynasty ruled both China and vast parts of Eurasia in the 13th and 14th centuries, yet the way its reign is recorded in Chinese sources sometimes differs from Persian or European accounts. Campaigns appear in different years, rulers' reign lengths vary, and events that should match across chronicles occasionally do not. Mainstream historians explain these issues as the inevitable result of translation errors, differing calendar systems, and the human tendency to reshape history for narrative purposes. But others see a more deliberate pattern: the possibility that China's historical record was consciously altered at various points to maintain a smooth, unbroken image of imperial legitimacy, even if that meant shifting or reshaping the past. The cover-up, if one exists, is subtle. It is not about erasing events outright, but about controlling the sequence in which they appear, ensuring that the story of China remains one of continuous civilization, guided by heaven's mandate, stretching further back than any rival's history. For scholars trying to align the histories of East and West, the Chinese dynastic drift is both a technical and philosophical challenge. It reminds us that our global timeline is not a fixed reality, but a carefully woven fabric, one in which the threads from different cultures don't always match perfectly. And in those mismatches, in the spaces where records do not quite align, there may be clues to a past that is older, shorter, or simply different from the one we have been told. The burning of the Library of Alexandria. Accident or intentional erasure? On the shores of the Mediterranean, in the ancient Egyptian city of Alexandria, there once stood a building that has become the most famous symbol of lost knowledge in human history: the Library of Alexandria. Founded in the 3rd century BCE under the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the library was part of the larger Mouseion, a research institution dedicated to the Muses, the Greek goddesses of the arts and sciences. It is said to have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works of literature, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, and geography from across the known world. The ambition of the library's founders was breathtaking. Ptolemaic policy reportedly required that any ship entering the port of Alexandria surrender its books for copying. The originals were kept in the library. The copies were returned to their owners. Over decades, this practice created what may have been the most comprehensive collection of human knowledge ever assembled in the ancient world. And then, it was gone. The traditional story is that the library was destroyed in a single cataclysm, famously blamed on Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, when his siege of Alexandria set fire to ships in the harbor, and the flames spread to the docks and nearby buildings. Ancient sources suggest that scrolls were indeed lost in that incident, but modern historians question whether it could have destroyed the entire collection. In truth, the library seems to have suffered multiple blows over several centuries. Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, attacks during the civil wars of the 3rd century CE, the decree of Emperor Theophilus in 391 CE, which sanctioned the destruction of pagan temples, possibly including the Serapeum, an annex of the library. And finally, the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 CE, during which later accounts, written centuries after, claim that the remaining books were burned to heat bathhouses for months. The problem is that each of these events is surrounded by contradictory accounts. Ancient sources disagree on the scale of the damage in each case. Some historians believe the library's destruction was gradual through neglect, political hostility, and targeted removals, rather than one dramatic blaze. This opens the door to a darker possibility, that the library's loss was not simply a tragedy of war, but at least partly intentional. Why would someone want to erase the library's contents? Several motives are conceivable. Political control, knowledge is power. In a world of competing empires, controlling what people do not know can be as important as controlling what they do. Religious supremacy. As Christianity rose to dominance in the late Roman Empire, pagan texts were increasingly seen as dangerous, heretical, or simply irrelevant. Destroying them could be framed as an act of piety. Economic advantage, scientific, medical, and navigational knowledge could be used to control trade routes and military strategy. Eliminating rival access to such information could shift the balance of power. Even if no single ruler ordered a total purge, the effect of repeated politically motivated destructions would have been the same, a slow bleeding away of the library's treasures until nothing remained. What might we have lost? It is impossible to say. Works of ancient historians like Manetho, A Detailed History of Egypt, treatises on technology by Hero of Alexandria, lost plays by Sophocles and Euripides, and perhaps even records of civilizations now forgotten. Some speculate that maps of lands beyond the known world could have been in its collection, knowledge that, had it survived, might have changed the course of exploration centuries later. In the end, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria is both a symbol and a warning. It shows how fragile human knowledge can be and how vulnerable it is to politics, ideology, and neglect. Whether it fell in a single night of fire or through centuries of targeted erasure, the library's fate reminds us that history is not just shaped by what is written, but also by what is allowed to survive. The destruction of Carthage, when victors rewrite the past. In 146 BCE, at the end of the Third Punic War, the city of Carthage, once the capital of a powerful maritime empire, was wiped from the face of the earth by its greatest rival, Rome. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus led the final siege. After 3 brutal years of blockade, famine, and street-by-street fighting, the city fell. According to ancient accounts, the surviving population was enslaved, the city burned, and its walls torn down. Roman writers claim the destruction was so complete that nothing was left but ruins. Carthage had been Rome's greatest rival for over a century. The Punic Wars had seen the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal march an army and war elephants over the Alps to threaten Rome itself. Though Hannibal ultimately failed, the wars had pushed Rome to the brink. Carthage remained a threat to Roman dominance in the Mediterranean, especially as a trading hub with vast wealth from commerce and agriculture. By the time of the Third Punic War, Rome had decided that Carthage must not merely be defeated, it must be erased. The destruction of Carthage is often portrayed as total, but here is where the historical cover-up begins. The Rome we know of the event is told almost entirely through Roman sources, Polybius, Appian, and later historians, all of whom wrote from the perspective of the victors. Punic records, if they survived the conquest at all, have been completely lost. This means that everything we know about Carthage's politics, culture, and even its crimes comes from the people who hated it most. One of the most famous stories about Carthage is the claim that its religion practiced child sacrifice to the god Baal-Hamon. Archaeologists have found cemeteries known as tophets containing urns with the cremated remains of infants and small animals, which some interpret as evidence of such rituals. Roman authors seized on these findings as proof of Carthaginian barbarity, using it to justify their annihilation. But was this accusation true, or part of Rome's propaganda? Some modern scholars argue that the tophets may have been cemeteries for children who died young, with the rituals being acts of mourning rather than sacrifice. In this interpretation, Rome exaggerated or distorted the practice to paint Carthage as a moral menace that deserved destruction. The economic dimension is just as important. Carthage was an agricultural powerhouse, producing grain, olives, and wine on a massive scale. Its fertile lands were a direct asset for Rome's expansion. By erasing Carthage, Rome not only removed a competitor, but seized a strategic breadbasket that would feed its armies for generations. The legend that the Romans salted the earth after destroying Carthage is almost certainly a myth. No ancient source from the time mentions it. This detail appears centuries later, likely as a symbolic flourish to underscore Rome's ruthless determination. But the fact that later storytellers felt the need to add such imagery shows how the destruction of Carthage became more than an event. It became a parable of total victory. What was lost in Carthage's destruction is immeasurable. The Punic language derived from Phoenician eventually died out. Carthage's maritime technology, trade networks, and possibly unique historical records vanished. We have no Carthaginian version of the Punic Wars, only Rome's. And Rome's version served a clear purpose: to present Carthage as a doomed, decadent society whose end was inevitable and righteous. This allowed Rome not just to claim victory, but to control how future generations would remember or forget its greatest rival. Centuries later, under Roman rule, a new Carthage was built on the site, eventually becoming a major city in the empire, but it was no longer Punic Carthage. It was Rome's creation, Rome's city, standing as a replacement for the one they had destroyed. The fall of Carthage is a reminder that history is often written by the victors, and that they have the power not just to shape the story, but to erase entire chapters of human civilization. The suppression of Mayan knowledge, conquest, and cultural erasure. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas in the early 16th century, they encountered the remnants of a civilization that had once built towering cities in the rainforest, mastered complex mathematics, and charted the stars with astonishing precision: the Maya. At the height of their classic period, 250 to 900 CE, the Maya had developed a sophisticated written language of glyphs, an intricate calendar system, and deep astronomical knowledge. They recorded their history, science, and religious traditions in codices, books made from bark paper, folded accordion style, and painted with vibrant colors. By the time the Spanish conquistadors entered the Maya lands of the Yucatan and Guatemala, the great cities had long since declined, but the cultural and intellectual heritage of the Maya was still alive, preserved in these codices, in temple inscriptions, and in the memories of their priests and scholars. That heritage did not survive the conquest intact. One of the most infamous moments in the suppression of Mayan knowledge occurred in 1562 when Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop of Yucatan, ordered the mass burning of Mayan books. De Landa believed these works contained superstitions and lies of the devil. His purge destroyed countless codices, along with idols and ceremonial objects. In his own words, "We found a great number of books, and because they contain nothing in which were not to be seen as superstitions and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree." To the Maya, this was not just the destruction of religious texts, it was the erasure of their recorded history. The codices contained astronomical tables, agricultural cycles, genealogies of rulers, and mythological narratives. Without them, vast portions of Mayan science and literature were lost forever. Today, only 4 authentic Mayan codices are known to survive: the Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier codices. They are scattered across European and American museums, and their survival is an accident of history, likely saved because they left the Americas before the full force of colonial suppression began. The loss of written records was compounded by the suppression of oral traditions. Spanish missionaries worked to replace Mayan religious beliefs with Catholic doctrine, often punishing those who continued to practice the old ways. Over generations, much knowledge faded or was hidden in syncretic forms. Christian festivals blended with indigenous rituals, saints identified with ancient gods. Even the physical traces of Mayan civilization were reshaped. Temples were torn down or repurposed to build churches, cities were abandoned, their monuments left to be swallowed by the jungle. Colonial authorities discouraged the use of the Mayan calendar and replaced it with the European one, severing the link between timekeeping and the cycles of the natural world that had been central to Mayan life. This was not a random byproduct of conquest. It was a deliberate strategy of cultural erasure. By removing the records and institutions that held a people's memory, the colonizers could impose their own narrative of history. In the Spanish telling, the Maya were a pagan people in need of salvation, their achievements acknowledged only to the extent that they could be framed as inferior to European civilization. The irony is that much of what we know about the Maya today comes from archaeological excavation, epigraphic decipherment, and the few surviving records, many of which contradict the colonial portrayal. The Maya were skilled engineers, mathematicians who understood the concept of 0 centuries before Europe adopted it, and astronomers who could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy. The suppression of Mayan knowledge stands as one of the clearest examples of how conquest is not only about territory, but about control over memory. It shows how a civilization's voice can be silenced, not by the destruction of its people alone, but by the deliberate obliteration of its records. Yet the Maya have not vanished. Descendants of the ancient Maya still live across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, preserving fragments of language, tradition, and belief. In recent decades, efforts to revive the Mayan script and reclaim lost history have gained momentum, a quiet defiance against the centuries-old attempt to erase them. The Vatican's secret archives, knowledge behind locked doors. Deep beneath the streets of Vatican City, behind guarded gates and climate-controlled walls, lies one of the most enigmatic collections of documents in the world, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archives. The word secret in the original Latin, secretum, simply meant private. But the reality is that this archive is far from a normal library. It is a restricted vault, accessible only to a select group of approved scholars, and even they may view only specific, pre-requested documents. No one may wander the shelves. No unauthorized person may see the full scope of what is stored there. The archive is immense. Estimates range from 50 to 85 kilometers of shelving, holding millions of documents spanning over 12 centuries. It contains papal correspondence, state papers, account books, treaties, trial records, and maps. In short, it is a paper record of the Vatican's influence across the globe. And with that influence comes suspicion. Some of the archive's contents are known. It holds letters from Michelangelo complaining about his payment for painting the Sistine Chapel, the excommunication document against Martin Luther, correspondence between the Vatican and Henry VIII during the crisis of his divorce, reports from missionaries describing newly discovered lands. But many other holdings remain completely unseen by the public, and here lies the fuel for centuries of speculation. What secrets might be hidden there? Some believe the archive could contain lost Gospels or early Christian writings that contradict the official biblical canon, documents relating to the trial of the Templars, revealing political motives behind their suppression, evidence of church involvement in political conspiracies from medieval assassinations to modern geopolitics, detailed records of scientific discoveries suppressed for contradicting doctrine. The church maintains that the restrictions are not about hiding scandal, but about protecting delicate ancient documents from damage and misinterpretation. They argue that the archive is slowly opening. Every year, certain materials older than 75 years are made available to scholars. And yet, the control remains absolute. Even qualified researchers must apply months in advance, specify exactly what they want, and are limited to a few documents per day. Photocopies or photographs are generally forbidden. If a document has never been cataloged for public access, it might as well not exist. The history of the archive itself hints at deliberate secrecy. It was formally established in 1612 by Pope Paul V during an era when the Catholic Church faced challenges from Protestant reformers, emerging nation-states, and scientific revolutionaries. At a time when controlling the narrative was vital, centralizing sensitive records in a secure, inaccessible location made strategic sense. One of the most intriguing known episodes concerns the documents on the Galileo affair, the trial in which the astronomer was forced to recant his support for heliocentrism. These documents were long kept under wraps and only gradually released, shaping centuries of perception about the Church's stance on science. And then there is the question of what has never been revealed at all. If the Vatican possesses early historical records, Roman administrative documents, ancient Jewish texts, or detailed accounts of events in the life of Jesus, those could fundamentally reshape our understanding of history. The possibility alone ensures that speculation will never end. The power of the Vatican Apostolic Archive is not just in what it holds, but in what it chooses to show. By controlling access, the Church controls the pace and framing of historical discovery. It ensures that any revelation happens on its own terms, in its own time. Whether the archive is a treasure chest of suppressed truths or simply a repository of bureaucratic history, its aura of secrecy is self-perpetuating. As long as its vast shelves remain mostly hidden, the idea that something earth-shattering lies within will endure. The lost inventions of antiquity, technologies that disappeared. We often think of technological progress as a steady climb, each generation building on the discoveries of the last. But history tells a different story. Civilizations rise and fall, and with them, so too can entire bodies of knowledge vanish. In the ancient world, there are tantalizing glimpses of technologies that existed, worked, and then were lost, sometimes for centuries, sometimes forever. One of the most famous examples is Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire from the 7th century onward. According to accounts, it could burn even on water, clinging to ships and spreading panic in naval battles. The exact formula was a closely guarded state secret. So closely guarded that when the empire fell, the recipe vanished with it. Historians and chemists have speculated it may have involved a combination of petroleum, resin, and quicklime, but no one knows for sure. In its time, Greek fire was not just a weapon, it was a tool of geopolitical dominance. Then there is Roman concrete, opus caementitium, a building material that has outlasted even the most modern equivalents. Structures like the Pantheon and aqueducts still stand after nearly 2,000 years. Their concrete far more durable than much of what we produce today. Modern research suggests that Roman concrete's longevity comes from volcanic ash, lime, and a process that allowed it to heal when exposed to water. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the technique was lost in Europe for centuries, replaced by weaker mortars, and only recently have scientists begun to rediscover its secrets. The ancient world also produced marvels of engineering that seem ahead of their time. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Greek shipwreck, is often called the world's first analog computer. Dating to around 100 BCE, it could predict astronomical positions and eclipses with astonishing accuracy through a complex system of gears. Nothing like it would appear again in Europe for over 1,000 years. Other inventions are known only through descriptions in texts. The mathematician and inventor Hero of Alexandria reportedly built steam-powered devices, including a primitive engine called the aeolipile. It produced rotational motion from steam pressure, a concept that would not be developed into industrial machinery until the 18th century. Why such technology did not spark an ancient industrial revolution is still debated. Some suggest that without the economic need or social structure to support mass production, such devices remained curiosities rather than tools of transformation. And then there are stories that border on legend, tales of Damascus steel, the blades of which were said to be strong yet flexible, capable of cutting through other swords or even stone. Historical examples show distinctive water-like patterns on the metal, the result of complex forging techniques and unique steel ingots imported from India. By the 18th century, the method for producing true Damascus steel was lost, and modern metallurgists are still trying to recreate it. The reasons these technologies disappeared are varied. Sometimes they were state secrets that died with their keepers. Sometimes they were casualties of war, knowledge destroyed when cities were sacked or libraries burned. Other times they faded away simply because the infrastructure or resources needed to produce them were no longer available. In a pre-industrial world without mass printing or digital storage, preserving and transmitting complex technical knowledge was fragile, dependent on human memory and physical manuscripts. The loss of such inventions raises an unsettling question. How advanced could humanity be today if we had never lost them? If the mechanical principles behind the Antikythera mechanism had been widely applied, if steam power had been harnessed in the Roman era, if the durability of Roman concrete had been retained through the Middle Ages, our timeline of technological progress might look entirely different. These disappearances are not just historical curiosities, they are reminders of how vulnerable human achievement can be. We think of innovation as permanent, but history shows it is possible to move backward, to forget, and to have to rediscover what once was known. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: if so much could be lost in the ancient world, what modern technologies, even entire sciences, might vanish if our own civilization faced a collapse? The ruins of the past suggest that the answer is not comforting. The Piri Reis map, evidence of forgotten exploration. In 1929, scholars cataloging maps at the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul stumbled upon something extraordinary: a fragment of a world map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary Renaissance-era chart, but a closer look revealed something deeply unsettling for mainstream history. The Piri Reis map, painted on gazelle skin parchment, depicted not only the coastlines of Europe and Africa with remarkable accuracy for its time, but also a detailed rendering of the eastern coast of South America. This alone was unusual, as European exploration of the continent was still in its early stages in 1513, but even more startling was the lower portion of the map, which appeared to show the northern coast of Antarctica, a full 3 centuries before its official discovery in 1820. And it wasn't just the inclusion of Antarctica that raised questions. The coastline shown was ice-free, suggesting it had been mapped before the continent was covered by the thick ice sheet we know today. According to geological studies, the last time parts of Antarctica's coast were ice-free was thousands of years ago. How could a 16th century Ottoman admiral have such information? Piri Reis himself offered a clue. In inscriptions on the map, he wrote that it was not his original work, but a compilation based on about 20 older charts, some of which dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. He also mentioned using maps captured from Spanish and Portuguese sailors, documents that may themselves have been copied from even older sources. This possibility that the Piri-Reis map preserves fragments of an ancient, lost tradition of global cartography has fascinated researchers and alternative historians for decades. It suggests that ancient civilizations might have explored far more of the world than we think, and that knowledge of these journeys was preserved in secret channels until resurfacing in Renaissance maps. Mainstream historians remain skeptical. They argue that the southern portion of the map is likely a distorted representation of South America's southern tip, not Antarctica. The accuracy of the coastlines could be explained by skilled cartographic interpolation rather than direct ancient observation. The supposed ice-free depiction, they suggest, may simply be an artistic interpretation. But skeptics cannot easily explain Piri-Reis's own claim that he used ancient maps, or the fact that several other early maps, such as those by Orance Fine and Gerardus Mercator, also depict a southern landmass resembling Antarctica, long before it was discovered. If these cartographers really did inherit geographic data from an unknown, earlier source, then the implications are immense. It would mean that thousands of years before the age of discovery, there was already a tradition of global navigation capable of mapping remote coastlines with extraordinary accuracy. Why would such knowledge be hidden? One possibility is that it was held by small groups, navigators, merchants, or scholars, who treated it as a competitive advantage. In the age of empires, controlling sea routes meant controlling trade, wealth, and power. Another possibility is that it didn't fit the narratives that emerging nation-states and the church wanted to promote. Admitting that ancient civilizations had achieved feats of exploration rivaling or surpassing modern Europe would challenge the story of European supremacy in world discovery. Whatever the truth, the Piri-Reis map remains an anomaly that refuses to disappear into the footnotes of history. It sits at the intersection of accepted cartographic tradition and a shadowy possibility that we have inherited fragments of a global map drawn long before Columbus ever set sail. If so, then the map is more than a historical curiosity. It is a piece of evidence, fragile, partial, but compelling, that the history of exploration may be far older and far stranger than we have been taught. The Polynesian Voyages, Pacific Navigation. Before the West, long before European explorers charted the Pacific, an extraordinary network of voyagers had already connected its farthest islands. The Polynesians, scattered across thousands of miles of open ocean, were among the greatest navigators in human history. From Hawaii in the north, to New Zealand in the south, to Easter Island in the east, they settled the world's largest oceanic triangle. This was no random drift. It was deliberate, planned navigation across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth without compasses, sextants, or written maps. The scale of this achievement is staggering. The Polynesians traveled in double-hulled canoes capable of carrying dozens of people, provisions, and even plants and animals for colonization. They relied on a deep, inherited knowledge of stars, ocean swells, wind patterns, and bird flight paths. This oral science was passed down through generations of master navigators, known in some traditions as wayfinders. For centuries, however, Western historians downplayed or denied this accomplishment. The prevailing 19th and early 20th century view, and shaped by colonial attitudes, held that the Polynesians had reached their islands by accident, blown off course in small canoes, and then remained isolated. The idea that they could have intentionally sailed thousands of miles was considered implausible. Why this dismissal? Partly because accepting the truth meant acknowledging that a non-European culture had achieved feats of exploration rivaling those of Columbus, Magellan, or Cook. Long before them, it disrupted the Eurocentric narrative that great voyages of discovery began in the West. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that this narrative began to crack. In 1976, the Hokulea, a traditional Hawaiian voyaging canoe, sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using only ancient navigation techniques. The journey proved that such voyages were not only possible, but repeatable with high accuracy. Since then, further voyages have retraced routes across the Polynesian Triangle, confirming that ancient navigators could and did maintain deliberate two-way travel. There is also growing evidence that the Polynesian voyages may have extended far beyond the Pacific Triangle. Studies of chicken DNA suggest that Polynesians may have reached the coast of South America before Columbus, bringing their domesticated fowl, a species absent from the continent before human introduction. Likewise, traces of South American sweet potatoes have been found in Polynesia, dating centuries before European contact. If true, this would mean Polynesian navigators crossed the widest ocean on Earth, made contact with another continent, and returned, an achievement on par with the most celebrated European expeditions. Why then did such knowledge nearly disappear from history? Colonization played a major role. European powers imposed their own narratives, replacing indigenous histories with Western accounts. The skills of wayfinding were suppressed or forgotten in many islands as Western ships took over inter-island transport. By the 19th century, only a few master navigators remained. The cover-up in this case was less about burning documents and more about erasing credibility. By framing Polynesians as passive drifters rather than deliberate explorers, colonial historians reinforced the idea that indigenous peoples needed European guidance and governance. Today, a renaissance of Polynesian navigation is underway. The Polynesian Voyaging Society and other cultural organizations have revived traditional training using oral instruction, observation of the natural world, and ocean voyages to pass the art to new generations. In doing so, they challenge centuries of distortion and restore the Polynesians to their rightful place among the world's greatest explorers. The Polynesian voyages remind us that history is not just about who arrived first, but about who gets credit and who has the power to tell the story. The Norse in North America, the real extent of Viking exploration. In the year 1000 CE, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus sailed west, Norse explorers crossed the icy waters of the North Atlantic and set foot on the shores of North America. Their story is preserved in the Vinland sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, which tell of voyages led by Leif Erikson and others to a fertile land rich in timber and wild grapes. For centuries, these tales were dismissed by mainstream historians as exaggerated legends. The prevailing belief was that Europeans had no contact with the Americas before Columbus in 1492. The Norse sagas were tolerated as folklore, interesting, but not evidence of real transatlantic exploration. That changed in 1960, when archaeologists Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The site contained unmistakable Viking artifacts, iron nails, a spindle whorl, and the remains of turf buildings identical to those in Greenland and Iceland. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement around the year 1000, exactly when the sagas claimed the voyages took place. The discovery forced a rewrite of history. The Norse had indeed reached North America. But here's where the cover-up, or at least the minimization, begins. Official narratives now acknowledged a Norse presence, but still portrayed it as brief, limited, and historically insignificant. The common account says they explored only the coastal fringes of Newfoundland, stayed for a few years, and left without lasting impact. Yet the sagas, combined with archaeological hints, suggest a larger story. They describe multiple voyages, encounters, both trade and conflict, with indigenous peoples they called Skraelings, an exploration far south of Newfoundland, perhaps as far as New England. Some researchers believe the Norse may have established seasonal camps deeper into the continent, or at least conducted repeated visits over decades. If such evidence exists, why don't we hear more about it? Part of the reason is that the discovery of a sustained Norse presence would challenge the deeply ingrained Columbus-centered narrative of discovery. For centuries, the age of exploration has been framed as a triumph of late medieval European innovation, not as a continuation of earlier contact. There is also the matter of territorial history. If Norse settlement sites were confirmed farther south, it could raise uncomfortable questions about indigenous European contact centuries before the Spanish and English colonized those regions. and what those encounters meant for both sides. Some traces do exist. Norse-style artifacts have been found in indigenous archaeological sites in the Canadian Arctic, suggesting trade networks that extended far beyond L'Anse aux Meadows. A walrus ivory chess piece found in Greenland may have originated from contact with North American indigenous hunters, and the saga's detailed descriptions of landscapes, forests, salmon-rich rivers, mild winters don't match Newfoundland's harsher climate, hinting at explorations further afield. Still, without large-scale excavations or political will to investigate beyond known sites, much of the Norse story in North America remains speculative. The absence of written records from the indigenous perspective means that the truth is filtered almost entirely through European sources, themselves centuries removed from the events. In recent years, renewed archaeological work has begun to uncover more about the Norse presence. In 2021, scientists confirmed that wood at L'Anse aux Meadows had been cut with metal tools in 1021 CE, the earliest precisely dated year for European activity in the Americas. This precision raises hope that further finds could illuminate the full extent of Viking exploration. The Norse in North America remind us that history is not only about the first to arrive, but about who writes the story afterward and what they choose to emphasize, diminish, or leave in the shadows. The Chinese treasure fleets, voyages that could have changed the world. In the early 15th century, while much of Europe was still in the late medieval period, China launched one of the most ambitious series of maritime expeditions in history. Under the Ming Dynasty, vast fleets, some of the largest wooden ships ever built, set sail across the Indian Ocean under the command of the Admiral Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 voyages that reached as far as the east coast of Africa, touching ports in modern-day Kenya and possibly beyond. His flagship, the so-called treasure ship, was said to be over 400 feet long, dwarfing the caravels of Columbus and da Gama that would sail decades later. These were not voyages of conquest, but of diplomacy, trade, and projection of power. The fleets carried silks, porcelain, and other Chinese goods, returning with exotic animals, giraffes, zebras, ostriches, as well as ambassadors from distant lands. The goal was to showcase China's wealth and influence, reinforcing its central place in a tributary network that extended across Asia and into Africa, and then suddenly it all stopped. After the 7th voyage in 1433, the treasure fleet was recalled. The construction of large ships was banned. Maritime expeditions were prohibited. Many of the ships were left to rot in their docks or dismantled. Records of the voyages were destroyed. Within a generation, China's naval dominance had evaporated. Why? Official Ming records framed the decision as a matter of cost. The voyages were expensive, and the court wanted to focus resources on defending the northern frontier against the Mongols. Confucian scholars, influential in court politics, often looked down on maritime trade as a distraction from China's agrarian ideals. But some historians see this as more than a budgetary or philosophical shift. They view it as a deliberate act of self-isolation and perhaps even a political purge. The eunuch faction at court, which had championed Zheng He's expeditions, lost power to conservative officials who preferred to consolidate China's authority at home rather than risk challenges from abroad. In erasing the records of the voyages, they erased the political legacy of their rivals. The destruction was thorough. While we have some surviving accounts, maps, and inscriptions, much of the detailed navigational knowledge and shipbuilding expertise that powered the treasure fleets was lost. When Europeans began arriving in force in the 16th century, China no longer had the same maritime capability to project power across oceans. This raises one of history's great what-ifs. Had China continued its naval expansion, it could have reached and possibly colonized territories that Europeans would later claim. Some theories, controversial but persistent, suggest that Zheng He's fleets may have even reached the Americas decades before Columbus, though concrete evidence remains elusive. The cover-up here is twofold. First, the erasure of records and physical capability, ensuring that the treasure fleet's achievements faded from collective memory. And second, the narrative control in official histories, which reframed the voyages as a curious, extravagant detour rather than a bold expression of global ambition. Today, Zheng He is celebrated in China as a symbol of peaceful exploration, but for centuries his name was little more than a footnote in Chinese history, proof of how effectively a state can decide which chapters of its past are remembered and which are quietly locked away. In the silence left behind, the great treasure ships rotted, and the memory of one of the most powerful navies in history slipped beneath the waves. A reminder that sometimes the most radical act of historical revision is simply to stop telling the story. The suppression of the true size of the Earth, from Eratosthenes to Columbus. Over 2,000 years ago in the city of Alexandria, a Greek scholar named Eratosthenes performed an experiment so elegant and so precise that it still astonishes scientists today. By measuring the angle of the sun's shadow in two locations, Alexandria and Sian, modern Aswan, and knowing the distance between them, he calculated the circumference of the Earth. His result, achieved in the 3rd century BCE, was remarkably close to modern measurements, about 40,000 kilometers. The Greeks of his era already knew the Earth was round, a fact taught in educated circles for centuries before Columbus. Eratosthenes simply measured it with accuracy that rivaled 20th century science. And yet, when Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he argued that Asia could be reached quickly by sailing west because the Earth was much smaller than Eratosthenes had calculated. Columbus was wrong. The Earth is larger, and if the Americas had not been there, his voyage would have failed. So why was his mistaken view accepted by the Spanish crown, and why was Eratosthenes' correct measurement not the guiding standard? The answer lies in selective acceptance of ancient knowledge. During the Middle Ages, Eratosthenes' works were preserved in some Islamic and Byzantine libraries, but were not widely read in Western Europe. By the 15th century, European scholars had access to some ancient geographical texts, yet they often relied on Ptolemy's later calculations, which underestimated the Earth's size. Columbus went further, shrinking it even more, and in doing so made his proposed voyage seem less risky and more profitable. Some historians argue that Columbus deliberately chose the smaller figures, ignoring or downplaying the more accurate ones because they supported his political and financial goals. If the Earth was known to be as large as Eratosthenes had said, his plan would have looked dangerously unrealistic, requiring months of sailing across an empty ocean with little chance of success. There's also the question of state interest. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were in competition with Portugal, which controlled the route to Asia, around Africa. Backing Columbus offered the chance of a faster, cheaper route, if his numbers were right. Accepting the smaller Earth gave them political cover to fund the voyage, even if the underlying math was dubious. Once the Americas were reached, the myth of Columbus's foresight became part of European imperial pride. The fact that he had misjudged the size of the Earth was glossed over in favor of the narrative that he had courageously challenged the flat Earth belief. Itself a historical myth, since most educated Europeans already knew the Earth was round. The cover-up here is subtle but powerful, replacing accurate ancient knowledge with a less accurate, politically useful version, and then shaping the public memory to fit a heroic tale. In this version of history, Columbus is the visionary who proved the Earth's roundness, rather than a navigator who got lucky because two continents happened to be in his way. Modern historians have tried to correct the record, pointing out that Eratosthenes' measurement was not only correct, but also widely achievable with the tools of the ancient world. Yet, the romanticized Columbus story remains dominant in popular culture and education, showing how effective centuries of narrative shaping can be. The suppression of the true size of the Earth was not about hiding a dangerous truth from the masses. It was about managing perception to serve political ambition, and in that sense, it was a cover-up as deliberate and consequential as any burning of books or sealing of archives. The Library of Alexandria, the disappearance of ancient knowledge. The Library of Alexandria has become a symbol, almost a myth, of humanity's lost knowledge. Built in the Egyptian city founded by Alexander the Great, it was said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated learning of the ancient world: history, philosophy, science, literature, and records from Egypt, Greece, India, Mesopotamia, and beyond. The dream was breathtaking. Under the patronage of the Ptolemaic kings, Alexandria became a hub of scholarship. Ships entering its harbor were reportedly required to surrender any books on board so that they could be copied. The originals were kept in the library and the copies returned. Scholars from across the Mediterranean gathered here, debating ideas and translating works into Greek. If any single place could have preserved the sum of ancient knowledge, it was this. And yet, by the end of antiquity, the library was gone. What happened to it remains one of history's most persistent mysteries. Some blame Julius Caesar, who, during his siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE, set fire to ships in the harbor, flames that may have spread to warehouses storing scrolls. Others point to later attacks such as Emperor Aurelian's campaign in the 3rd century CE, which damaged parts of the city, or the decree of Theophilus in 391 CE to destroy pagan temples, which may have included the Serapeum, a sister library. Another theory places the final blow in 642 CE, during the Arab conquest of Egypt. Later medieval sources claim the scrolls were burned to heat the city's baths for months, though many historians doubt this story, noting it was recorded centuries after the event and may be apocryphal. The truth is likely more complex, not a single catastrophic fire, but a slow death. Political instability, shifting cultural priorities, religious suppression of certain texts, and simple neglect may have combined to scatter and destroy the collection over centuries. Whatever the exact cause, the loss was catastrophic. Imagine the manuscripts that might have been there, complete histories of ancient civilizations now known only in fragments. Treatises on medicine and astronomy far ahead of their time, philosophical works by thinkers whose names we have never heard. Some speculate that the library might have preserved records of ancient voyages, mechanical inventions, or forgotten mathematical breakthroughs that could have altered the trajectory of history. Why, then, is the destruction of the library sometimes treated almost casually in ancient sources? One possibility is that the loss of such knowledge did not seem as urgent to leaders focused on immediate political or religious goals. Another is that the very magnitude of the loss made it easier to pass over in silence. Acknowledging it would mean confronting the fact that humanity had allowed its greatest treasure to vanish. The cover-up here is not one of active concealment, but of historical minimization. No empire wanted to be remembered as the one that destroyed the beating heart of ancient scholarship. By spreading the blame, by allowing the details to blur, the event slipped into legend rather than indictment. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the Library of Alexandria's story has repeated itself in smaller ways across the centuries. Archives, libraries, and repositories of knowledge have been destroyed by fire, flood, war, or deliberate censorship, each time erasing pieces of the human story. In that sense, the Library of Alexandria is not just a singular tragedy, but a warning, one we have still not learned to heed. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient computer hidden by time. In the spring of 1901, a team of sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera stumbled upon the wreck of an ancient ship. Among the statues, amphorae, and other treasures they brought to the surface was a corroded lump of bronze and wood, so unremarkable at first glance that it sat in storage for months before anyone examined it closely. When scholars finally looked inside, they were stunned. Beneath the corrosion lay intricately cut bronze gears, interlocking in a way no one had ever seen from the ancient world. Over decades of study, aided by X-ray imaging and 3D scanning, the object became known as the Antikythera mechanism, and its purpose emerged. It was a mechanical computer built over 2,000 years ago. The device could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and possibly planets. It tracked lunar phases, calculated eclipses, and may even have been able to forecast the timing of the ancient Olympic Games. Its gearwork, At least 30 precision-made bronze wheel was so advanced that nothing comparable appeared again until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe more than 1,000 years later. Who built it? Scholars debate whether it came from the school of Hipparchus, the Greek astronomer of the 2nd century BCE, or from designs influenced by Archimedes. The craftsmanship suggests not a one-off experiment, but a tradition of mechanical engineering now entirely lost. And this is where the mystery deepens, and where the idea of a historical cover-up enters. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates a level of technological sophistication that doesn't fit neatly into the standard timeline of ancient science. If such devices existed, why do we have no written records of their construction, no surviving examples besides this one? One explanation is the fragility of the materials. Bronze was often melted down and reused, so intricate devices would vanish unless preserved in unusual circumstances, like a shipwreck. But another possibility is that such technology was guarded knowledge restricted to elite circles for purposes of navigation, astrology, or political prestige. In that case, its loss could have been accelerated by wars, regime changes, or even deliberate suppression by those who saw no benefit in disseminating such complexity. The fact that the Antikythera mechanism lay forgotten in a museum storeroom for years after its discovery also speaks to a kind of modern cover-up, not intentional, but born of indifference. It did not fit the prevailing view of ancient Greece as scientifically curious but mechanically primitive, so it was not a priority for study until decades later. Since then, research has transformed our understanding, yet much remains unknown. Some missing fragments may still lie on the seabed, others could be in private collections, misidentified or ignored. If multiple devices once existed, their absence from the archaeological record is striking, suggesting either extreme rarity or intentional concealment. What is clear is that the Antikythera mechanism is not the beginning of a story, it is the end of one. It is the last surviving echo of a lost tradition of craftsmanship and astronomical calculation that vanished from the historical record, leaving us to wonder how far that knowledge once reached. Its discovery challenges a comfortable narrative that human technological progress is a steady climb from primitive to advanced. Instead, it shows that peaks of brilliance can appear, only to be buried, literally and figuratively, for centuries, hidden by time and by the choices of those who control the telling of history. The Baghdad Battery, forgotten ancient electricity. In 1938, while cataloging artifacts at the National Museum of Iraq, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König came across an odd clay jar. It was small, just over 5 inches tall, with a copper cylinder inside and an iron rod down the middle. At first, it looked like an ordinary storage vessel, but König noticed that the metal components were not decorative. They were functional. When reconstructed, the jar seemed capable of holding an acidic liquid such as vinegar or lemon juice. This would create a chemical reaction between the copper and the iron, producing a small electrical current. König speculated that the object was, in effect, a battery, one made around 2,000 years ago, possibly during the Parthian or early Sasanian period. The idea that ancient peoples might have harnessed electricity was startling, and it quickly caught the public imagination. Soon the term Baghdad Battery entered popular culture, often accompanied by bold theories. That it was used to electroplate gold onto silver, that it powered some kind of medical device, or even that it was evidence of advanced technology passed down from a lost civilization. Mainstream archaeology, however, has been cautious, even dismissive. Critics argue that the jars may have been simple storage containers, possibly for scrolls or papyrus. The battery interpretation, they say, rests on modern assumptions rather than direct evidence of use. No ancient texts describe such a device, and no wires or other components have been found alongside the jars to suggest an electrical circuit. Yet, experiments have shown that replicas of the Baghdad battery filled with acidic liquid can indeed produce small voltages, enough to give a mild shock or to power very simple processes like electroplating. The question then becomes, if ancient artisans discovered this effect by accident, Could they have applied it in specialized contexts? This is where the possibility of a cover-up or downplaying emerges. Acknowledging that ancient cultures may have experimented with electricity would disrupt the standard timeline of technological development. It would also invite uncomfortable questions. If they discovered it, why didn't it lead to more complex electrical devices? Was the knowledge intentionally kept secret by a small group of craftsmen? Was it lost during political upheavals, much like other ancient technologies? It's worth noting that history contains other hints of electrical curiosity. Ancient Egyptian depictions in the Dendera temple have been interpreted, controversially, as large bulb-like objects, though mainstream scholars see them as symbolic imagery. In the Greco-Roman world, static electricity was observed in amber and fir, though it was regarded as a curiosity rather than a power source. If the Baghdad battery was indeed a functional electrical device, its disappearance could be explained by its limited application. In a pre-industrial world, without the infrastructure to exploit electricity on a larger scale, such a discovery might have remained a workshop trick, valuable to a few, irrelevant to most. In that case, when empires fell or trade networks collapsed, the knowledge could easily vanish. Today, the original artifact sits quietly in a museum display case, stripped of the controversy that once surrounded it. Replicas appear in science museums and classrooms where they are used to spark curiosity rather than rewrite history. But the deeper question remains unanswered. Was the Baghdad battery a remarkable ancient experiment that hints at lost scientific traditions? Or is it simply an ordinary jar that modern minds have electrified with imagination? In either case, its story is a reminder that sometimes the line between discovery and dismissal is drawn not by the evidence itself, but by the willingness of history's gatekeepers to consider possibilities that lie outside the accepted script. Ancient brain surgery, the forgotten art of trepanation. In the popular imagination, ancient medicine is often portrayed as crude, a mix of herbal remedies, ritual chants, and dangerous guesswork. Yet archaeological evidence tells a more complex story. Among the most striking discoveries is the widespread practice of trepanation, the deliberate removal of a section of the skull, often without fatal injury. Trepanation is the oldest known surgical procedure, with examples dating back at least 7,000 years. Skulls bearing round or rectangular openings have been found on every inhabited continent, from Neolithic Europe to pre-Columbian South America. Far from being random or sloppy, many of these operations show remarkable precision. Edges are smooth, and signs of bone healing indicate that patients often survived for years afterward. Why was this done? In some cases, trepanation may have been performed to relieve pressure from head injuries, a treatment still used in modern neurosurgery. In others, it may have been intended to treat neurological disorders, headaches, or seizures. There is also evidence that it held spiritual or ritual significance, with the opening serving as a passage for harmful spirits to leave the body. The survival rates are what surprise modern observers most. In some ancient Andean cultures, success rates for trepanation appear to have exceeded those of battlefield cranial surgery during the American Civil War, a stunning reversal of expectations about medical progress. And yet, despite its effectiveness in certain contexts, trepanation all but disappeared from mainstream medicine for centuries. By the late medieval period in Europe, it was rare and often viewed with suspicion. In modern times, it is practiced only in highly specialized neurosurgical contexts. So why was such a demonstrably successful procedure largely abandoned? One reason may be the shift in medical authority. As formalized medical schools emerged in the medieval Islamic world and later in Europe, many traditional practices were dismissed as folk or primitive, even if they worked. Techniques not fitting the new theoretical frameworks were marginalized or forgotten. Another factor is the absence of written records from many of the cultures that practiced trepanation most successfully. Without detailed surgical manuals, the skill could not be easily transmitted across generations once the living tradition ended. This made it vulnerable to being written out of medical history by those who controlled its narrative. There is also a darker possibility. the political suppression of indigenous knowledge. In colonial contexts, European authorities often dismissed or outlawed native medical practices to assert cultural dominance. By branding such surgeries as barbaric, they reinforced the idea that colonized peoples needed Western medicine, even when the Western version had worse outcomes. Today, modern medical historians are revisiting trepanation with fresh eyes. CT scans of ancient skulls reveal careful planning and execution, sometimes with the use of multiple techniques, scraping, drilling, or cutting, depending on the case. The instruments, whether stone, bronze, or iron, were adapted for precision rather than brute force. The cover-up here is not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy, but a combination of neglect, bias, and active discrediting. The result is the same. An ancient surgical technique with a surprisingly high success rate was largely erased from the accepted lineage of medical progress. When we talk about the dark ages of medicine, perhaps we should also talk about the ages when light was deliberately extinguished, when effective practices were allowed to vanish, not because they failed, but because they came from the wrong hands. The Roman concrete formula, a building secret, lost for millennia. Walk through the ruins of ancient Rome and you'll notice something remarkable. Many Roman structures are still standing after 2,000 years. The Colosseum, aqueducts, harbors, and massive domes like the Pantheon have weathered centuries of earthquakes, floods, and wars, often in far better condition than modern concrete buildings barely a century old. The secret lies in Roman concrete, or opus cementitium, a material so durable that it has baffled engineers for generations. Unlike modern Portland cement, which can crack and weaken over time, Roman concrete often seems to get stronger as it ages, particularly when exposed to seawater. For centuries, the exact recipe was thought to be lost. Ancient authors like Vitruvius left descriptions, but they were vague, mentioning volcanic ash from Pozzuoli, lime, and seawater, but not the precise methods or proportions. When the Western Roman Empire fell, the large-scale use of this material declined, replaced by simpler and less durable building techniques during the medieval period. Why did the knowledge disappear? Partly, it was the collapse of the Roman trade network that supplied key ingredients, such as the volcanic ash from specific regions of Italy. But there's also a case to be made for knowledge suppression through neglect. As political power shifted, there was less incentive to preserve or transmit the specialized skills of Roman engineering. Medieval builders developed their own techniques, and Roman methods became curiosities rather than standards. Modern analysis of Roman concrete samples has revealed its secrets, and they are even more ingenious than expected. The volcanic ash contained minerals that, when mixed with lime and seawater, triggered a chemical reaction creating calcium aluminum silicate hydrate crystals. Over time, cracks in the concrete allowed water in, which dissolved and reprecipitated minerals, effectively healing the concrete from within. This self-healing property explains why Roman harbors, built directly in saltwater, have survived for millennia, while modern piers crumble in decades. It also suggests that the Romans understood, at least empirically, how to create a material that interacted beneficially with its environment. The cover-up here is subtle. It's not that the formula was locked in a vault and hidden, but that it was allowed to vanish through a combination of resource scarcity, shifting priorities, and the rewriting of technological history. Later generations celebrated Roman architecture but rarely acknowledged that its longevity was due to a chemical sophistication that medieval and early modern builders did not replicate. Only in the last few decades have scientists pieced together the full picture through microscopic analysis and chemical testing. In 2017, a study showed how seawater actually strengthened Roman marine concrete. In 2023, researchers finally identified the lime clasts in the mix as intentional, hot mixing the lime with water to create reactive compounds that could repair damage over time. If this knowledge had been preserved, the history of construction might have been very different. Cities, bridges, and harbors could have been built to last centuries instead of decades, potentially saving enormous resources. But Without the Roman trade network and political will to maintain such expertise, the secret recipe became a ghost in the ruins, admired but not understood. Today, engineers are looking to revive Roman concrete for sustainable building. If successful, it will be a rare case where an ancient technology, once lost to neglect and the shifting tides of history, returns to shape the future. The Indus Valley Civilization, a forgotten giant of the ancient world. In the dry plains of modern Pakistan and northwest India, archaeologists in the 1920s uncovered the remains of two vast cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. What they found overturned the prevailing view of ancient history. Long before Rome, long before even the rise of Egypt's pyramids, the Indus Valley civilization had flourished here, an urban culture of startling sophistication. Dating back at least 4,500 years, the Indus cities had straight grid-planned streets, multi-story brick houses, advanced drainage and sewage systems, public baths, standardized weights and measures, and evidence of long-distance trade reaching Mesopotamia. For a Bronze Age civilization, this was extraordinary. And yet, unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus left behind no grand palaces or temples. Instead, their cities seemed designed with civic order and public welfare in mind. The most baffling mystery is their writing system. Hundreds of seals and tablets bear inscriptions in a script that has resisted all attempts at decipherment. Without a Rosetta Stone to translate it, we have no direct record of their laws, beliefs, or political organization. It is one of the only major ancient civilizations whose voice remains entirely silent. And here is where the idea of a cover-up or historical neglect enters. Despite its size, possibly supporting a population of over 5 million, the Indus Valley civilization is often given only a passing mention in world history courses, dwarfed in attention by Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. Part of this is due to the lack of deciphered texts. Without their own words, it's harder to fit them into the standard historical narrative. But there's also a geopolitical layer. The territory of the Indus lies across the modern borders of India and Pakistan, two nations with tense relations. This has complicated collaborative archaeological research. Nationalist narratives in both countries sometimes claim the Indus heritage as their own, while downplaying interpretations that don't align with political or religious identities. Another factor is colonial history. Much of the early excavation was done under British rule, which often framed non-European civilizations in ways that minimized their achievements or tied them to external influence. Some early scholars even suggested, without evidence, that the Indus cities must have been built by outsiders, unable to accept that such urban planning could arise independently in South Asia. Then there's the question of their disappearance. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities were abandoned. Theories range from climate change and river shifts to trade collapse and disease. Some suggest nomadic Indo-Aryan migrations may have played a role, though this is controversial. Without written records, the truth remains elusive, and in that uncertainty, political narratives can fill the gaps. The Indus Valley civilization's absence from mainstream awareness is not just an accident of archaeology. It reflects how the story of humanity has been shaped by which voices are heard and which are left in the dust. In the quiet ruins of Mohenjo-daro, with its perfect right-angled streets and its great bath still standing after 4 millennia, you can feel the weight of that silence. A civilization that mastered urban living long before most of the world even built cities is still waiting for its story to be told in full. And the longer that wait, the easier it is for the world to forget it ever existed. The Kingdom of Kush, Egypt's overlooked southern rival. South of ancient Egypt, along the Nile in what is now Sudan, lay the Kingdom of Kush, a civilization that rivaled, traded with, and at times ruled over Egypt itself. For over 1,000 years, Kush was a political, military, and cultural force in Northeast Africa, yet it remains almost invisible in popular history. The Kushites emerged around 2000 BCE in the region the Egyptians called Nubia. Rich in gold, ivory, and other resources, Nubia was both a valuable trade partner and a tempting target for Egypt's expansionist pharaohs. The two cultures influenced each other deeply, sharing gods, art styles, and architectural forms. But Kush was not simply a copy of Egypt. It developed its own distinct traditions, including the building of hundreds of small, steep-sided pyramids that still stand today. The most dramatic chapter in Kushite history came in the 8th century BCE, when King Pi invaded Egypt and established the 25th dynasty, known as the Kushite dynasty. For nearly a century, pharaohs from Kush ruled a united Nile valley, reviving temple building and religious traditions that had waned. This era was seen by some Egyptians as a cultural renaissance, but in later Egyptian histories, and especially in the accounts of classical Greek and Roman writers, the Kushite rulers were often minimized or portrayed as outsiders. When the Assyrians invaded Egypt in the 7th century BCE and forced the Kushites to retreat south, the official Egyptian narrative largely erased their period of rule, framing it as a brief interlude rather than a legitimate dynasty. The cover-up continued in modern times. Early European Egyptologists working in the 19th and early 20th centuries tended to treat Nubia as a peripheral culture, focusing instead on the grandeur of Egypt. This bias was partly racial. The idea that a sub-Saharan African kingdom could conquer and rule Egypt did not fit comfortably into colonial narratives that linked civilization to the Mediterranean world. As a result, the Kushite pyramids and temples received far less attention and funding for preservation than Egyptian sites. Many were left to deteriorate or be looted. Kushite inscriptions written in the still undeciphered Meroitic script have been slower to study than Egyptian hieroglyphs, further limiting our understanding. Even today, the story of Kush is often told as a side note to Egypt's history, rather than as the chronicle of an independent and powerful state. This framing obscures the fact that Kush not only resisted Egyptian dominance for centuries, but also reversed it, turning the Nile's political map upside down. The irony is that the Kushites themselves revered Egyptian culture and saw their rule over Egypt as a restoration of ancient ideals. They maintained temples, honored the old gods, and presented themselves as rightful heirs to the pharaohs. Yet the people whose traditions they upheld later wrote them out of the spotlight. In Sudan today, the legacy of Kush is a source of national pride, but the archaeological sites still face threats from looting, development, and neglect. Each year, sand drifts higher against the sharp sides of the Nubian pyramids, and the memory of the Black Pharaohs risks slipping further from public consciousness. History, it seems, is often written from the north, looking south. The kingdom of Kush stands as a reminder that power flows both ways, but only those who hold the pen decide which way the story is told. The Hittite Empire, the Bronze Age superpower, that vanished 3,000 years ago in the highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a mighty empire ruled over vast stretches of the ancient Near East. The Hittite Empire rivaled Egypt, clashed with Babylon, and controlled a network of cities and vassal states stretching from the Aegean to the edge of Mesopotamia. Yet, for most of modern history, no one even remembered they had existed. In the late Bronze Age, around the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, the Hittites were a force to be reckoned with. Their capital, Hattusa, was a walled city with massive gates adorned with lion and sphinx reliefs. They fielded powerful chariot armies and developed advanced ironworking skills that gave them an edge in weaponry. In 1274 BCE, they fought the Egyptians at the famous Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in history. The result was a stalemate, and the world's first known written peace treaty, signed between Pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III. And then, silence. By around 1200 BCE, during the wave of turmoil known as the Bronze Age collapse, the Hittite Empire fell apart. Cities were burned, the capital abandoned, and their once mighty political system dissolved. For the next 3 millennia, the Hittites were gone not only from power, but from memory. In the Bible, Hittites are mentioned only as a small Canaanite people with no hint of their former imperial glory. This total disappearance from the historical record is one of the most complete erasures of a major civilization ever seen. When European explorers and scholars began uncovering ancient sites in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, they had no idea they were walking over the ruins of the Hittite heartland. The rediscovery began with mysterious stone inscriptions in an unknown hieroglyphic script and cuneiform tablets written in an unfamiliar language. It wasn't until the early 20th century that scholars pieced the puzzle together. The inscriptions belonged to the Hittites, a long-lost empire whose own archives at Hattusa contained tens of thousands of clay tablets. These records revealed a rich political, military, and cultural history that had been completely absent from the standard story of the ancient world. Why was the memory of the Hittites so completely erased? Partly it was geography. Their Anatolian heartland was far from the Nile or Mesopotamian floodplains where later civilizations recorded their own past. But there may have been deliberate suppression as well. The Hittites were direct rivals to Egypt and Assyria, both of which survived them and wrote the histories that were passed down. It would have served those victors well to portray the Hittites as minor players if they mentioned them at all. There's also the simple fact that writing can be as fragile as stone is enduring. The Hittites' records were written on clay tablets stored in palace archives. Once those archives were destroyed, their stories vanished. Without surviving monumental inscriptions on the scale of Egypt's temples, their memory faded quickly. The rediscovery of the Hittites in the modern era forced historians to redraw the political map of the Late Bronze Age. Suddenly, Egypt's main rival in the north was no longer a vague enemy from Asia, but a fully realized empire with kings, diplomacy, and its own cultural achievements. The cover-up here was not one of intentional falsification, but of total erasure through omission. A gap in the record so complete that even scholars doubted such an empire could have existed until the evidence was literally dug out of the ground. Today, Hattusa is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its colossal city walls and ceremonial gates a silent testament to a power once feared across the ancient world. Yet outside of specialist circles, the Hittites remain strangely obscure, a reminder that even the mightiest can vanish from history if no one remains to tell their story. The Olmec civilization, the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Hidden in the shadows, long before the rise of the Maya or the Aztec, there was another great civilization in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico. Flourishing from around 1500 BCE to 400 BCE, the Olmec civilization is often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization that laid the cultural foundations for all that followed. And yet, despite its enormous influence, the Olmec remain one of the least understood of the world's ancient peoples. The Olmec heartland, in the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, was a landscape of rivers, wetlands, and fertile soil. Here they built ceremonial centers such as San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. These were not mere villages, they were planned complexes with massive stone monuments, earthen pyramids, and sophisticated drainage systems. Their most famous legacy is the series of colossal stone heads, some weighing over 20 tons, carved from basalt and transported from quarries many miles away. The heads depict individual rulers with distinctive features and ornate headgear, their expressions calm, yet imposing. To this day, they remain among the most iconic works of ancient art in the Americas. But the Olmec contributed far more than art. Archaeological evidence shows that they developed many of the cultural hallmarks of later Mesoamerican civilizations: a ritual ball game, monumental architecture, complex religious iconography, a calendar system, and possibly even the earliest known writing in the region. In other words, they planted the seeds of the civilizations that would dominate Mesoamerica for the next 2 millennia. So why are they not a household name like the Maya or Aztec? Part of the answer lies in the way history is recorded. By the time Spanish chroniclers arrived in the 16th century, the Olmec had been gone for nearly 2,000 years, and no living culture claimed direct descent from them. Their name itself, Olmec, meaning rubber people in Nahuatl, was given by the Aztec to a region, not a people, and was applied by archaeologists much later. The result is that the Olmec were written out of the living memory of Mesoamerica. Later civilizations inherited their cultural forms but rarely acknowledged their origins, either because the connection had faded or because political legitimacy came from claiming divine right, not human predecessors. The modern cover-up, if we can call it that, comes from the uneven way archaeology has been conducted. For much of the 20th century, the Olmec were under-researched compared to the Maya and Aztec, in part because their sites were in remote, humid regions that made excavation difficult. Funding and academic prestige tended to flow toward the spectacular temples and glyphic texts of the Maya, leaving the Olmec in the background. There's also a more controversial angle. Some early researchers, uncomfortable with the idea that so many Mesoamerican innovations could originate with an older, less documented culture, argued that the Olmec were not truly indigenous innovators, suggesting instead they were influenced or even founded by outsiders from Africa or Asia. While fringe theories, these ideas distracted from serious study of the Olmec as a homegrown civilization. In truth, the Olmec did not vanish suddenly. Their major centers declined around 400 BCE, possibly due to environmental changes or shifting trade networks. But their cultural influence spread outward. The symbols, rituals, and city planning concepts they pioneered were woven into the fabric of later civilizations, their origins obscured over centuries of reuse and adaptation. Today, slowly, the Olmec are being restored to their place as a foundational civilization of the Americas. But their story is still largely invisible to the general public, a reminder that even mother cultures can be hidden in the shadows if the societies that inherit their legacy fail to name them. The Sogdian traders, the lost middlemen of the Silk Road. For centuries, the Silk Road was not a single road, but a vast network of trade routes linking China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Along these paths flowed silk, spices, precious metals, glassware, and ideas that reshaped entire civilizations. And at the very heart of this system, acting as the crucial middlemen, were the Sogdians, a people who today are almost entirely absent from popular memory. The Sogdians came from Sogdiana, a region centered in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Their cities, such as Samarkand and Bukhara, became hubs of commerce and culture between the 4th and 8th centuries CE. They spoke an Eastern Iranian language, wrote in their own distinctive script, and practiced a cosmopolitan form of life shaped by constant contact with foreign traders and travelers. What made the Sogdians remarkable was not just their skill in commerce, but their role as cultural translators. They spoke multiple languages, learned the customs of their trading partners, and often acted as diplomats and emissaries. They carried not only goods but also stories, music, religious ideas, and artistic styles from one end of the Silk Road to the other. Chinese records from the Tang dynasty describe Sogdians as the dominant merchant group in Central Asia, operating caravans that linked the great powers of the day. In fact, the Chinese term for certain kinds of merchants was simply hu, a catch-all word that often referred to Sogdians in particular. So how did a people so central to one of the most important trade networks in history vanish from our collective memory? Part of the answer lies in the shifting political landscape. As the Tang dynasty expanded into Central Asia and the Islamic Caliphate spread from the west, Sogdiana became a contested borderland. The Arab conquests of the 8th century brought Islam to the region, and over time the Sogdians were absorbed into the broader Persianate Muslim culture. Their language faded, replaced by Persian, and their distinct identity dissolved. There was also an erasure in the written record. While the Chinese preserved some accounts of Sogdian merchants, they focused on the empires, not the middlemen. Islamic historians, writing later, folded the Sogdians into the story of the Islamic Golden Age without emphasizing their pre-Islamic role. The result was a civilization that had been central to Eurasian exchange for centuries becoming a footnote in someone else's narrative. Archaeology has helped restore some of their story. Excavations in China have uncovered richly decorated Sogdian tombs, complete with murals depicting banquets, musicians, and scenes of trade. In Central Asia, the ruins of Sogdian fortresses and merchant estates speak of a confident and wealthy society. These finds reveal that the Sogdians were not just traders, but also patrons of art, facilitators of religious diversity, and cultural innovators in their own right. And yet, because they were not an empire with armies and monumental capitals, but a network of mobile, adaptable merchants, their story is harder to tell. History tends to remember conquerors, not connectors. The Sogdians' genius was in linking worlds, and when the political and economic systems they depended on collapsed, their visibility disappeared with them. Today, a handful of scholars and Central Asian heritage projects are working to bring the Sogdians back into the story of the Silk Road. But outside of academic circles, they remain one of history's great invisibles, proof that entire civilizations can be hidden in the spaces between the more famous names on the map. The Cathars, the medieval faith that was wiped out. In the sunlit valleys and fortified hill towns of southern France, a very different kind of Christianity once took root. By the 12th century, this region, known as Languedoc, was home to the Cathars, a religious movement whose beliefs diverged sharply from those of the Catholic Church. The Cathars were dualists. They believed the material world was created by an evil force and the spiritual realm by a good one. To them, the visible church, with its wealth and political power, was part of the corrupt material order. They rejected the authority of the Pope, refused to recognize the sacraments as valid, and saw no need for an elaborate priesthood. Their leaders, called perfects, lived in extreme simplicity, practicing vegetarianism, abstaining from wealth and sexual relations, and serving as spiritual guides to the community. Ordinary believers could live more conventional lives, but aspired to receive a ritual called the consolamentum before death, which they believed would free their soul from the cycle of reincarnation. To the medieval Catholic hierarchy, this was not just a theological disagreement, it was an existential threat. By challenging the Church's authority, wealth, and monopoly on salvation, the Cathars undermined the very structure of medieval Christendom. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal military campaign aimed at eradicating Catharism. Northern French nobles, eager for land and power, joined the effort. Town after town was besieged. At Béziers, thousands were slaughtered, Catholics and Cathars alike, with the papal legate reportedly saying, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The war dragged on for 2 decades, devastating the region. But even after military defeat, Cathar beliefs persisted underground. The Church responded with the newly created Inquisition, which hunted down suspected heretics, interrogating, torturing, and executing them. By the mid-14th century, organized Catharism had been destroyed. The cover-up here was deliberate and twofold. First, the physical destruction of the Cathar communities, their leaders executed, their followers scattered. Second, the erasure of their memory. Almost everything we know about Cathar beliefs comes from hostile Inquisition records, written to portray them as dangerous heretics. No Cathar-written theological texts survive in full. If they existed, they were systematically destroyed. This means that their worldview reaches us filtered entirely through the words of their enemies, making it difficult to separate propaganda from reality. Some scholars argue that the Church exaggerated Cathar doctrines to justify extreme measures, painting them as anti-Christian or morally corrupt to rally public support for their suppression. The eradication of the Cathars also served a broader purpose. It brought the independent-minded Languedoc region firmly under the control of the French crown and the Catholic Church, ending its unique culture of relative religious tolerance and linguistic independence. Today, the ruins of Cathar castles like Montségur and Les Tours cling to rocky peaks in southern France, silent witnesses to a faith that was methodically erased. Modern interest in the Cathars has been fueled by romantic legends and conspiracy theories, some linking them to the Holy Grail or the Knights Templar. While many of these claims are speculative, they speak to a deeper truth. The Cathars' actual beliefs were silenced so completely that myths have rushed in to fill the vacuum. The destruction of the Cathars was one of the clearest examples in medieval Europe of a total cultural erasure, not just defeating an enemy, but ensuring that their ideas, identity, and history would vanish from public memory. And in large part, the plan worked. The cult of Isis, Rome's erased rival religion. Long before Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, another religion was winning converts from Britain to the shores of the Black Sea. The cult of Isis, devoted to the ancient Egyptian goddess of motherhood, magic, and the afterlife. Isis had been worshipped in Egypt for over 1,000 years before Rome rose to power. She was the divine mother who resurrected her slain husband Osiris and nurtured their son Horus. Over time, her image shifted from a purely Egyptian deity to a universal mother figure, protector of sailors, giver of wisdom, and comforter of the afflicted. By the 1st century BCE, the cult had spread far beyond Egypt's borders, carried by merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. In cities across the Roman world, temples to Isis, called Isiums, became centers of ritual, music, and theatrical reenactments of her myths. Followers prayed for healing, safe passage on voyages, and personal salvation. What made the cult of Isis so appealing was its accessibility. It welcomed men and women, rich and poor, slaves and free citizens. Its ceremonies were emotionally engaging, offering a sense of personal connection to the divine that traditional Roman state religion lacked. In many ways, the cult functioned as a spiritual competitor to emerging Christianity, offering a promise of eternal life and a close, loving deity. This popularity worried Roman authorities. As early as 53 BCE, the Senate tried to limit the building of Isiums in Rome itself, fearing the cult's foreign origins and its independence from official religious structures. Yet the faith persisted, even under intermittent bans. Several emperors, including Caligula and later Domitian, either tolerated or actively patronized Isis worship, while others suppressed it. The turning point came in the late 4th century CE, when Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the state religion of Rome and banned all pagan worship. Temples of Isis were closed, destroyed, or converted to Christian churches. Statues of the goddess were defaced or buried. Her priests and priestesses vanished from the record. The cover-up here was a deliberate campaign of religious replacement. Early Christian writers often portrayed pagan deities as demons or false gods, and Isis was no exception. Elements of her iconography, a mother holding a divine child, were reinterpreted within Christian art as images of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. While this may have been a natural overlap rather than outright plagiarism, it blurred the historical memory of Isis for later generations. Over time, the cult of Isis faded from public knowledge, remembered only dimly as part of the superstitions of ancient Egypt. The rediscovery of her temples and inscriptions during the Renaissance and later archaeological excavations revealed just how widespread her worship had been. From Pompeii to London, from Carthage to the Danube, traces of the goddess lay hidden under layers of earth and centuries of deliberate forgetting. Today, scholars see the cult of Isis as one of the most significant religious movements of the ancient Mediterranean, a faith that offered comfort, dignity, and hope to millions. Yet its suppression and absorption into the dominant Christian framework ensured that for over 1,000 years, her name was known only to antiquarians and poets. The ruins of her temples still stand in places like Philae in Egypt, where carvings of Isis survived only because the island was remote and difficult to reach. These remnants are fragile reminders that history's victors do not merely defeat rival beliefs, they reshape memory itself until the old gods are not just gone, but forgotten. The Eleusinian Mysteries, Greece's greatest secret ritual, silenced forever. In the fertile plain of Eleusis, just outside Athens, stood one of the most important sanctuaries of the ancient Greek world. For nearly 2 millennia, people came here to take part in the Eleusinian Mysteries, secret religious rites honoring the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone. These ceremonies were not public festivals, they were initiatory mysteries. Anyone, Greek or foreigner, man or woman, slave or free, could be admitted provided they spoke Greek and had not committed murder. But once initiated, They were bound by a vow of absolute secrecy. What happened inside the sacred hall, the telesterion, was never to be spoken of. We know only fragments of what the mysteries involved. The rites centered on the myth of Persephone's abduction by Hades and her mother Demeter's grief. The story symbolized the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Scholars believe initiates were shown sacred objects, participated in symbolic reenactments, and perhaps drank a potion called the kykeon, which some speculate may have contained psychoactive ingredients. The purpose was profound. Initiates were promised a blessed afterlife. Ancient authors who had undergone the mysteries hinted at their transformative power. The playwright Sophocles wrote, "Blessed are those who have seen the rites before they go below to Hades, for they alone have life there." For centuries, the Eleusinian mysteries were a unifying religious experience for the Greek world. Even Roman emperors sought initiation. The ceremonies survived wars, political upheavals, and even the rise of Christianity for a time. The end came in the late 4th century CE, when the Christian emperor Theodosius I banned all pagan rituals. The mysteries, with their secrecy and pagan theology, were incompatible with the new state religion. In 396 CE, the sanctuary at Eleusis was destroyed during an invasion by the Visigoths, reportedly with the encouragement of anti-pagan Christian factions. The cover-up here is unusual because the mysteries were always secret. There were no written manuals to burn, no public texts to erase. When the rites ceased, their knowledge simply vanished. Later, Christian writers dismissed them as superstition or demonic deception, further discouraging any attempt to preserve their memory. This means that one of the longest-running religious traditions in human history, possibly practiced for over 2,000 years, left no clear record of its rituals. The silence was not just enforced by the initiates' oaths, but by the victors who had no interest in remembering a rival path to spiritual salvation. The irony is that the mysteries' secrecy, which had preserved their sanctity for so long, made them especially vulnerable to obliteration. Once the community of initiates was broken, there was no way to reconstruct the rites without violating their core principle. Today, the ruins of Eleusis still draw visitors, and archaeologists can trace the outlines of the telesterion. But the heart of the mysteries, the whispered words, the symbolic acts, the transformative visions, is gone. All we have are hints from the edges, the awe in ancient testimonies, the fragments of art, the traces of sacred procession routes leading to the sanctuary. In this way, the Eleusinian mysteries stand as one of history's most perfect erasures, a tradition famous across the ancient world, yet now entirely unknowable. The secret was kept so well that it died with its keepers, a silence that has lasted for over 16 centuries. The Druids, the erased priests of the Celtic world. In the misty forests and windswept hills of Iron Age Europe, the Druids stood at the heart of Celtic society. They were priests, judges, healers, philosophers, and keepers of the people's oral traditions. Without temples of stone or written scriptures, they carried their culture's knowledge in memory, passing it down through generations by word of mouth. The Druids' authority was immense. They advised kings, mediated disputes, conducted sacrifices, and presided over seasonal festivals that marked the turning of the year. They were also astronomers and natural philosophers, able to calculate lunar cycles and interpret the will of the gods through the patterns of nature. But the Druids themselves left no written accounts, a deliberate choice. According to Julius Caesar, they believed that committing their teachings to writing would cheapen their value and weaken the memory. This oral exclusivity kept their knowledge within a trained elite, but it also meant that when the Druids were suppressed, much of their wisdom vanished forever. The Roman Empire saw the Druids not only as religious leaders but as a source of political resistance. In Gaul, modern France, and later in Britain, the Druids were suspected of uniting Celtic tribes against Roman rule. Roman writers accused them of practicing human sacrifice, a charge that may have been exaggerated or used as propaganda to justify suppression. In 60 CE, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus launched a brutal assault on the island of Anglesey, Mona, off the coast of Wales, a known Druidic stronghold. Tacitus describes Roman soldiers cutting down sacred groves and slaughtering priests and followers. With the destruction of their sanctuaries and the absorption of Celtic lands into the empire, the Druids' organized presence was shattered. The cover-up here was not just military, it was historical. Almost everything we know about Druids comes from Roman and later Christian sources, all of them hostile or dismissive. Roman authors framed the Druids as dangerous, barbaric mystics. Medieval Christian scribes recast them as sorcerers or demon worshippers. Their role as learned philosophers, legal arbiters, and community leaders was downplayed in favor of sensational tales of blood rituals. This distorted portrayal persisted for centuries. By the time Celtic lands were fully Christianized, the Druids had been reduced in popular imagination to figures of legend, folded into folklore and myth. They became magical Druids of fairy tales, not historical figures of political and spiritual authority. Modern archaeology and comparative studies have begun to recover a more balanced view. The Celts' intricate metalwork, astronomical alignments in their monuments, and surviving oral traditions hint at a sophisticated worldview. Yet without the Druids' own words, we can only reconstruct fragments. The deliberate Roman suppression, combined with the Druids' own refusal to write, created a double erasure. Their enemies destroyed their institutions. Their own traditions left nothing tangible behind. The result is a historical void where a vibrant intellectual class once stood. Today, neo-Druidic movements seek to revive aspects of this lost heritage, but they must build on scattered references, archaeological clues, and later, myth. The real Druids, as they existed in the centuries before Rome, remain largely beyond our reach, their true philosophy buried with the last of their initiates. The Oracle of Siwa, the silenced voice of the desert. In the far western desert of Egypt, close to the Libyan border, lies the Siwa Oasis, a green jewel of palm trees and freshwater springs surrounded by miles of golden dunes. Here, in the 6th century BCE, a temple was built to Amun, the great god of Thebes, and it became home to one of the most mysterious prophetic voices of the ancient world, the Oracle of Siwa. The journey to reach Siwa was arduous. Caravans crossed barren desert, vulnerable to heat, sandstorms, and raiders. This isolation gave the oracle an air of mystical remoteness. Pilgrims came seeking divine guidance, and the priests of Amun interpreted the god's will through rituals, dreams, and cryptic pronouncements. The oracle's fame spread far beyond Egypt. Its most famous visitor was Alexander the Great. In 331 BCE, after conquering Egypt, Alexander trekked across the desert to consult the god. Ancient accounts are tantalizingly vague about what was said, but some claim the oracle addressed him as the son of Amun, divine confirmation of his right to rule not just Egypt, but the world. For centuries, rulers and generals sought the oracle's blessing before embarking on campaigns. Merchants and commoners, too, came to ask questions about travel, marriage, and fortune. The oasis became a hub where Egyptian, Greek, and Berber cultures mingled. And then, slowly, the voice of the oracle fell silent. By the Roman period, other centers of prophecy were declining as well, victims of changing religious landscapes. In the 4th century CE, when Emperor Theodosius I banned pagan worship across the empire, the temple at Siwa was closed, its priests dispersed, its rituals forbidden. The cover-up here was subtle but complete. Unlike great urban temples whose ruins loomed over cities, the Oracle of Siwa lay far from the centers of power. With its abandonment, there were no scribes to record its prophecies, no inscriptions to preserve its history. Christian chroniclers rarely mentioned it, and when they did, it was as a relic of superstition, unworthy of remembrance. What little we know comes from scattered classical sources, Herodotus, Plutarch, and later historians, none of whom were present for the oracle's greatest moments. Even Alexander's consultation is shrouded in ambiguity, with different authors giving conflicting accounts. This lack of clear record may have been intentional. After all, suppressing pagan prophecy meant more than shutting temples. It meant erasing the idea that divine authority could come from anywhere but the Christian God. The physical site itself also vanished from public awareness. Over centuries, desert sands and local building reuse dismantled much of the temple. Only in modern times have archaeologists rediscovered the remains. Crumbling walls, carved stones, and the foundations of the sanctuary where Amun's priests once spoke to kings. Today, the Siwa Oasis is a remote but growing tourist destination. Visitors can still climb to the Temple of the Oracle, now a ruin, and stand in the chamber where Alexander may have heard the god's voice. Yet the words spoken there, promises, warnings, or coronations, are lost forever, swallowed by the same silence that claimed so many ancient sacred sites. The Oracle of Siwa's disappearance was not marked by a single dramatic destruction, but by a gradual fading, the kind that leaves barely a ripple in written history. And perhaps that is the greatest irony. A place once sought for divine answers has become one of history's unanswered questions.